Hey guys, tonight we step into a street so early it still belongs to cats and chimney smoke, where your breath makes little ghosts in the air and a lantern swings like a sleepy metronome above a dew. The stones are cool, the shutters are closed, and the city is turned down to a whisper, waiting for you to turn it back up to warm. You probably won't survive this in the sense that by the first tray of crusts, you'll melt into a puddle of contentment and pretend the alarm never happened. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening, drop a note with where you are and what time it is. I love seeing our midnight map stretch across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shoulder through the chilly dark in wool and habit. Sabots clacking softly wooden shoes are the original ASMR past shuttered stalls that will later host cabbages and gossip. The air tastes faintly of river damp, horse, and a promise of heat still hiding in yesterday's ash. Overhead, a thin moon minds its own business, while a watchman minds everyone else's, nodding when he recognizes the baker's pace, early, steady, resigned to flour in the hair. You carry a key that is less a piece of iron than a permission to make morning happen. At the bakehouse door you pause, give the lintel its habitual tap fingertips to wood to memory and slip inside. The room offers darkness that isn't empty, the shape of the great vaulted oven, the patient outline of the trough, and the faintest red eye of banked coals under ash like a hidden ember heart, near the oven mouth. A little pewter token of Saint Honor, patron saint of bakers, hangs from a nail. You touch it because that's what hands do, whether for faith or for superstition. Either way, the gesture oils the hinge of the day. Somewhere, a cat you don't admit feeding makes a hopeful chirp from the flour sacks. You pretend not to hear. The cat pretends not to beg. You both pretend very loudly. You kneel to coax the embers awake, teasing air through the ash with a bellows that wheezes like an old uncle telling the same story again. A glow strengthens, then threads itself into little flames, and soon the oven's mouth holds a dim sunrise of its own. It's ordinary magic, this daily resurrection. And you perform it with the calm of someone who knows how the story goes because you told it yesterday and you'll tell it tomorrow. Mainstream fact, because your sleepy brain likes one solid stone to step on. In 17th century France, bread is the staple, the bulk of a common family's calories. The thing that moves from table to temper in an instant if it goes scarce. You don't think about riots here in the quiet. You think about crust. You hang your lantern on its hook and take stock by its patient circle of light. The tools are where they should be. Long wooden peels leaning like spears by the oven, a scoring knife waiting for its turn later. The scale waits in their box, the scoop resting in the flour bin. A damp linen cloth sits folded like a sleeping gull. And the trough smells faintly of yesterday's DOA, sent with both memory and advice in it. On the wall, a chalk tally reminds you how many loaves the Bakers Guild expects you to produce for the day, and how many sous will move back the other way. Nobody likes math before dawn, but bread doesn't bake itself on poetry. You prod the fire again, then open the flue just enough to let the oven draw without swallowing your morning's warmth. There were places, not so long ago, where you would have had to trudge to the Lords for Benalda Seigneur's common oven, and pay to use it. Your dough marching in company with every other household's. Historians still argue whether, by the 17th century, those feudal oven rights had faded in most towns or lingered stubbornly in pockets. But in this street, under this roof, the oven is yours to tend, your bricks to temper, your timing to trust. You read the draft like a language, spine straightening when it's right. You set out the small chores that knit the hour into a rhythm. Scrape the table smooth with a worn board. Brush away yesterday's runaway flour, which has a talent for appearing on entirely new surfaces while you aren't looking like fashion trends or rumors. Check the flour sacks, the fine white froment for wealthier customers. The darker mix for those who buy honest bread with honest coins. You pinch a little between finger and thumb. Good flour feels like a quiet promise. If the harvest has been thin, you taste the difference even with your eyes closed. In many provinces, rye creeps into the blend during lean years, and you ride the change like you ride weather. By the door stands a bucket for well water, braced against tipsy apprentices and overeager cats. You lift the lid, smell the cold iron of it, and set it near the trough to take the edge off the chill. Later you'll balance the warmth of water against the breath of the room, a small domestic astronomy of temperatures and time. Salt waits in a lidded jar on the shelf, salt that carries, inside itself, the echo of attacks that everyone curses and nobody escapes. The gabble is not your friend, but it is your companion, and you'll pinch the measure the way your master taught you. Neither stingy nor wasteful, because the dough remembers both sins. Outside, the street yawns itself awake a centimeter. A cart rattles somewhere. A rooster explains himself to a church bell. Frost writes its brief essay on a windowsill and then forgets its conclusion. You unbar the shutters to let in a blade of early blue, not much light, but enough to tint the flour dust as it drifts. The bakehouse breathes differently when the world can see in, even a little. You breathe with it, shoulders lowering. A joke keeps you company if dawn had a snooze button. Bakers would need to, and you let the smile be small and warm, like an ember you keep under your tongue. You pull a small, cracked saucer from a nail where it dries and place it on the oven stones for a minute. Then touch it and lift it gingerly. It's an old baker's trick. The way heat licks the clay tells you how ready the oven skin has become. Some swear by a handful of flour thrown against the deck the color it burns to is a language. Others go by sound, an almost musical note when you knock the peel against the hearth. You're multilingual in this one odd way, because ovens, like cats and customers, refuse to use a single dialect when two would do. On a shelf by the door sits a bundle of straw twisted into a little charm. An aunt left it years ago with a murmured warning against cold bread. Not bread physically cold, but bread that catches bad luck and won't rise. You don't believe in it, except on days you do, which tend to be the days when storms thicken and fermentation sulks, and you'll take any ally offered. Quirky fact. Some bakers tie a fragment of last year's festival ribbon to the oven handle so it remembers joy. You haven't cut yours off, and that counts as an opinion. You run your hand along the trough's rim and think of work yet to unfold: flour, water, salt, and the living memory of levain waiting like a sour little genius in its jar. Yeast from breweries wanders through cities these days, hitching rides on barrels and gossip, and some shops flirt with it for lighter dues. But you're married to your starter. Passed down like a stubborn heirloom. Historians still argue whether most bakers in your century leaned mostly on sourdough or on added barm from alehouses. And the truth probably lives as truth likes to do somewhere that changes from street to street, season to season. The cat decides you have ignored it enough and rubs a question mark against your shin, collecting flour on its whiskers in a way that suggests either loyalty or a wardrobe malfunction. You sigh, crumble a bit of last night's crust into a saucer, and set it down. Because you are weak, and the cat is persuasive. It eats like it invented hunger, and then takes up a post by the oven to supervise your technique. That's the third joke you get before sunrise. You, a master of fire and flour, managed by a creature whose contributions include naps and upper management attitudes. You bank the coals one last time, close the iron door to the ash pit with the care of someone tucking in a child, and stand a moment with your palms out to the growing heat. The bakehouse hums faintly, wood settling, draft whispering, lantern purring along, and in that simple soundscape you feel the city turn a little on its axis. Work isn't a cliff here, it's a path you know by heart, with milestones that have the shape of familiar tools and familiar gestures. The door is unbarred, the chalk is fresh, the oven remembers the sun, and your shoulders remember the day. You lift the flour scoop, set the bucket within reach, and slide the levain jar toward the trough. The light is still gray, but it's enough to crown the dust motes and outline your hands. One ember pops softly behind you like a tiny applause. You answer it with motion, with habit, with the small precise courage of beginning. The city will taste this hour soon enough. For now, it's yours. You dip the scoop and let flour fall in a soft, steady rain, the sound like whispering parchment. You test it the same way you test every new sack. Pinch, rub, listen. Good flour has a hush to it drubbed. Between finger and thumb, it almost squeaks from dryness and fineness. A tiny mouse of a noise you've come to trust. You hold a pinch under your lantern and look for the faint sparkle that means the millstones were sharp and the bolting cloth did its job. Too many little brand freckles and you know this batch will drink more water and ask for more patience. Too much talc smooth whiteness and the rich clients will grin while your conscience reminds you the field didn't grow perfection for free. A quick taste, yes. Bakers taste flour. You're a sommelier of dust tells you if there's any bitterness from overheated stones. The cat approves this scientific method by blinking slowly, which in feline means, carry on. You set aside the finer ferment for morning bowls and pull forward a sack with a darker personality for the workaday loaves. A mingling of wheat and the honest shadow of bran. Mainstream fact, to plant a flag, 17th-century French flour, wasn't one thing. Millers sifted with Tommy's bolting cloths of different grades to make fleur de farine, for white bread and rougher blends for the majority. Who chewed more virtue than vanity? The difference isn't snobbery alone. Brand changes hunger into endurance. Still, your hands know the customers who will ask for bread as pale as winter sunlight, and those who will be satisfied so long as it's warm, crackly, and fairly priced. You draw the bucket of well water closer, feel the chill kiss your knuckles, and give it the tests you trust. Clarity against the lantern's ring. A quick sniff for swampy moods, the back of hand splash to measure temperature without pretending you own a thermometer. Hard water stiffens dough and sharpens the crust. Soft water coaxes tenderness. You've learned to bend either into service. Because a baker arguing with water is like a sailor arguing with wind. Philosophically interesting, commercially unwise. Historians still argue whether the famous Parisian crumb owed more to oliverance wheats or to the mineral character of local wells. Bakers mostly argue with clocks. You run a finger around the bucket's rim and picture the dough you want, supple, politely sticky, a little proud. Salt waits in its lidded jar, crystalline and innocent, which is not how anyone describes the gabelle that rides on it. You tip out what you need onto the scale. Mindful that salt is the quiet governor of the whole morning. Too much, and your dough sulks and tightens. Too little and it races off, giddy and shapeless. A pinch falls, and you smile at the old superstition that spilling salt calls trouble. Unless you toss a bit over your shoulder to blind the devil. You do it because why not? If the devil is lurking in a bakehouse at this hour, he deserves a little briny surprise. Quirky tidbit. Some shops keep a salt spoon no one is allowed to wash, believing a clean spoon washes luck away. You compromise by wiping it on your apron and calling that theology enough. Now the jar of Levainier sourdough starter slides forward like an old friend with a complicated personality. You untie its cloth cap and breathe in. Green apple, warm cider, a hint of buttered leather if you're in a poetic mood. The bubbles look alert but not frantic, the surface a little domed. The edges just beginning to recede. Yesterday's feeding clearly pleased it. You whisk a finger through, and the scent opens. Bright and tangy, you talk to it under your breath, gentle sarcasm, affectionate threats because starters, like managers and cats, respond best when they think every idea was theirs. Historians still your house has married the sour and only flirts with the ale. You scale a portion of the levain into a wooden bowl. The chef, the mother, and feed what remains with a spoon of flour and a splash of water, stirring until the ribbons smooth out and the mixture sits like a satisfied child. You cover it again and set it somewhere neither cold nor cocky. Too close to the oven and it sprints into exhaustion. Too far and it broods. You label the bowl with a notch on the rim, a private timeline you can read in the dark. A fringe practice some apprentices swear by is giving the starter a name and a ribbon. You keep the ribbon on Saint Honor's nail and save names for future children and current cats. Still, when you say all right, old friend, you mean a jar. You tip flour into the trough, making a hill with a crater, a tiny lunar landscape. In goes a measure of water, then the levain. Then the first courteous sprinkle of salt early so it dissolves, but not so early it scalds the yeast. You stir with your hand, an instrument with better sensors than any tool. The dough goes from paste to tangle to promise. You add water by feel, not formula. Because flour remembers whether how long the sacks sat in a damp barge. How eager the miller was with the cloth, and no chart can outvote dampness. Here's the first joke of the hour. Every recipe says as needed, which is baker for good luck. You'll figure it out. The mass goes shaggy, then just begins to collect, and you pause. The silence inside the bakehouse changes tone in moments like this, as if the room itself takes a breath with the dough. You sweep a few dry bits toward the center and press them in. Nothing wasted, not even a flick of a finger. You splash a little more water along the rim to gather strength. And when the dough feels like a wet rope rather than a swamp, you stop. That edge where enough becomes too much is a line you've learned to walk like a tightrope with flour on it. Mainstream fact again, tucked into the motion. Salt not only seasons bread but strengthens gluten and slows fermentation. Without it, loaves blow up like boastful stories and collapse almost as fast. You rest the mixture a short while in autolus, though you don't call it that. You call it letting it think. Flour hydrates, gluten starts to knit, and your shoulders enjoy a tiny holiday. You rinse the stickiness from your fingers in the water bucket, the swirl carving a small galaxy in the pale depths, and wipe your hands on your apron, which was once clean in a previous lifetime. You sketch a small cross on the dough. A habit some call piety, and others call benchmarking. If the cut widens just so, the mix is right. Historians still argue whether this sign was a universal gesture of faith, or simply a useful baker's gauge with a blessing stapled on. Either way, the line tells you what you need to know. When you return, the dough has sighed into itself, edges smoothed, surface less obstinate. You sprinkle a veil of flour, and slide your hands underneath, feeling the weight shift like an animal settling. All right, you tell it, time to become something. That's joke number 2. Dough loves a motivational speech. You tuck and turn until it stops clinging and starts cooperating, and then you pull the cloth over it to protect it from drafts. The oven behind you murmurs approval. The cat, who has never needed anything except your nerves, curls in a patch of warm light to demonstrate advanced loaf-shaped sleeping. One more check, the scales. Guild weights wait in their little polished box, each one stamped, each one a reminder that inspectors love numbers the way bakers love smell. You set them out because later you'll want no arguments about size. Standard loaves keep fines away. Quirky detail. Some masters keep a customer's loaf on a high shelf, oversized and overbaked. A conversation piece and quiet warning. Imagine the tax on that. You keep a crust there instead. From a day that went exactly right. A little trophy that says the oven can be kind. You glance at the window slit where dawn, trying not to be obvious, smudges the street with ash blue. Time to fold in decisions. Which batch gets the fine flour? Which gets the everyday mix? Who will ask for a twist of anise? Who will want yesterday's loaf sliced thin for soup? You pull the cloth back, lay your hand on the dough, and feel it answer cool, even, expectant. The third joke arrives, gentle. You own 2 pets, a cat and a jar, and only one of them reliably comes when fed. Behind the jokes, the method holds. Flour, water, salt, leaven for plain words that turn into a city's breakfast. You tilt the bowl and watch the starter ribbon through the pale mass like a memory threading the present. Yesterday taught today, and tomorrow will feed from what you save back now. The room smells faintly of apples and stone, the oven of hearth, your hands of wheat. What begins as dust and well water is already deciding to become bread. You close your eyes, listen for the quiet fizz that says the levain woke happy, and nod. The day can go on. You eye the woodpile the way a captain eyes the sea grain, length, and mood because today's heat starts here. Billets lie in tidy cords, ends sawn true, bark scaly and dry enough to crack when you tap it. Beech and oak are your favorites. Beech for a clean, even flame. Oak for long loyal embers. Ash does good work too. And now and then a sliver of apple or pear from a neighbor's pruning makes the bakehouse smell faintly of orchard gossip. Poplar you avoid. It smokes like a poet and leaves you with apologies. The cat inspects a knot, approves the pile, and assumes a supervisory nap. You build the fire in the vaulted oven with chess player patience, kindling first fine twigs and shavings saved in a dry crock laid like a bird's careful plan. Over that, a cradle of slender sticks, with air rungs to tempt the draft. Flint to steel, a spark to charcloth. A quiet cupping of palms, and the infant flame decides to grow up. The flue answers with a faint pull, a whispering breath. The oven remembers how to inhale. You ease the first billet onto the cradle, then another, and step back to let the fire become itself. This oven is a brick beehive, a round-backed creature with its own weather. It's a black oven in the old sense. You burn wood inside the chamber. Rake the embers out, then bake in the heat that the masonry hoards. Mainstream fact to nail to the hearth. Bakers have long red readiness in soot-black bloom on the dome, turning white as the carbon burns away. When the ceiling flashes pale, the temperature has crossed a threshold worth respecting. You watch for that brightening the way sailors study a wind shift, pretending not to see meager. You feed billets steadily, not greedily. A greedy fire dazzles and forgets to think. You want depth, not drama. As flame leans toward the back, you pick up the fire along. Forked rod with a scarred handle and push coals into a crescent, then back again, teaching the bricks an even lesson. The oven replies with tiny pings as the crown warms, a music of microscopic shifts. You claim you can hear keys, upper register for too hot, lower for not yet. That's partly physics, and partly the kind of superstition every workshop collects like flour in its corners. Now the flue becomes your barometer. You open it to clear first smoke, then tame it so the warmth won't sprint skyward. There's a right breath to a good oven, a draw that hums rather than roars, that coaxes flame along the floor, up the back, and out with decorum. Historians still argue whether provincial ovens in this century were thicker-walled and slower to heat than Paris cousins' differences in clay, brick supply, and fuel costs, but every baker learns the dialect of their own vault. Yours prefers slow courtship, and then, suddenly, generosity. You test the front lintel, where stone meets brick with the back of your hand, the way you'd check a child's brow. Warmth here means heat is traveling. Warmth only at the mouth means you're late. A pinch of flour tossed on the deck blooms blonde and vanishes without scorching better. But not yet. You send 2 billets to university. As you joke, go learn to be heat, and listen to the chimney gossip. First joke of the hour. The flue is basically an old aunt if you don't manage her. She manage you on. She always has a story about your technique. Between feeds you stack the next armful, sorting lengths into 2 neat ranks, sturdy 16 inchers to build heat and lighter sticks to dance it toward the edges. Mainstream fact worth a nod. Firewood in big towns is measured and regulated, sold in cords or toys, with inspectors frowning at short measure and damp logs. A city's appetite for bread is also an appetite for timber. Porters heave it from river quays all day, and bakers pay in coin and complaints. You keep notes on which woodseller cheats by dampness and which makes billets that sing when they burn. The oven mouth begins to glow with that tame sunrise hue of orange, deepening toward patient gold, soot on the crown pales. A damp rag swabbed across the deck hisses in a confident tenor. You rake fire across the back wall, then pull it to the sides, teaching the floor from corner to corner. The tools are their own choreography. Long peel, short peel, rake, and ecovillain, the oven mop whose wet cloth head will soon whisk ash from the stones. Quirky tidbit. Some bakers scent that mop water with a sprig of bay, because a grandmother swore the oven behaves better when it thinks of supper. You can't prove physics agrees, but memory does. You glance at the levain jar, your little bubbling oracle land back to the flame. Timing is an argument the oven always tries to win, so you bargain in small moves. Another damper nudge, 1 stick to the left flank. A pause to let the fire reconsider its behavior. Drafts shift with weather and luck. On rain-heavy mornings they mope, on bright frosty ones they strut. You keep pace, counting breaths as if walking a skittish horse past a noisy market. One hand on the iron, one ear attuned to the chimney's opinion. You crouch to hearth level and watch flame travel. You want a low-licking run that kisses the floor and rolls up the back like a ribbon. If it leaps, you're feeding too fast. If it crawls, you're starving it. The ash pit door clinks as you move it a finger width. A single finger can shift you from warm to why is everything taking forever. Here, ritual helps. 2 billets, 1 billet, rake, a count of 5. Habit becomes a metronome that keeps worry from borrowing trouble. The cat demonstrates calm by doing nothing perfectly. As heat moves into brick, the room smell changes from raw wood to a complex warmth toast's older cousin. You sweat lightly even in the cool dawn and roll your shoulders for the work ahead. The vault's mouth shows a painter's chart, apricot, ember. Then a brief flash of white where soot burns clean. You mark the moment on your inner clock. You're entering the window. When the oven will take loaves and repay them with spring and crust. A testing scrap goes in yesterday's dough flattened to a coin and leopard spots in 3 breaths. Soon. You flatter the oven quiet compliments, like salt, go a long way. Second joke. If you could tip the oven, you'd write it a love letter. As it is, you settle for good wood and punctual attention. You rake the coal bed forward, then clear a path where first loaves will land. The eco-villain takes its turn. You swab the stones and listen to the quick, satisfied hiss as ash lifts and steam wakes the surface. The cloth returns clean by the 3rd pass. The deck looks like polished slate. 1 more billet for a final drink of heat. 1 more damper kiss to keep the draw polite. You think of regulations and deacons who will weigh loaves later. Planning the sequence. Big country rounds first while the oven runs hottest. Then middleweights, batards, and bowls. Then, as bricks relax, sweeter things that prefer kindness to discipline. Mainstream fact to keep nearby. Price and weight are watched by guild officials and sometimes by the city itself. Too light or too small and you pay in fines and in reputation, which is harder to earn back than coin. The oven is as much your business partner as your hearth. For luck you tap the tiny Saint Honor medallion by the mouth. Not because brass alters physics, but because the light glances off the saint's face in a way that steadies your hands. Another superstition lingers. An old master forbade whistling in the bakehouse, saying it calls the wind down the flue. You don't whistle, mostly because your mouth is busy with bread thoughts and because the cat would file a complaint. Third joke. If whistling truly summoned wind, you'd hire a choir and give the chimney a concert. When, at last, the fire subsides into a red-banked smile at the edges, the dome wears a dusting of pale, as if someone chalked the sky. Heat is no longer just in the air. It has soaked into the bricks, into their patient memory. You rake the last bright coals aside, watch the deck darken to its baking sheen after the mop, and hold your hand near the mouth, not touching, never touching, just to feel the honest wall of warmth. Historians still argue whether most city bakehouses fired once for dawn bread or twice for later pastries. You'll ride today's afterglow as far as it goes. The oven, for all its animal noises and moods, is ready. The street doesn't know it yet, but the morning has already been decided in brick and flame and the soft logic of drafts. You turn toward the bench, where the dough has been thinking while you courted fire, and the bakehouse seems to lean forward with you, eager and awake. The room leans into candlelight flame, cupped by a brass holder, wick whispering, shadows folding and unfolding over the bench like sleepy wings. You set the gill-checked weights on the scale so they thump with that serious little sound that says, yes, mathematics is awake too. Iron numbers meet iron plate. A 1, a 2, a half. All stamped, all fussy. All the reason inspectors can look smug before breakfast. Mainstream fact, planted right here among the flour ghosts. 17th-century bakers in French towns belong to corporations, guilds with rules on loaf, weight, and price. And officials do come weigh your production and your patience. Your counterargument is simple. Make the math delicious. You run the scraper wooden-bodied, metal-lipped coupete around the trough, shaving yesterday's last whispers to create a clean, slightly damp stage. The sound is friendly, a polite shuck-shuck as you tidy. You always check the trough's joints with a fingertip. Wood swells and shrinks with the mood of the weather, and a gap would drink your water like a thirsty monk. Along the inner rim, your private notches hide in plain sight, a shallow scratch for the big market batch, to nicks for the neighborhood run, a cross for festival mixes. Quirky tidbit. Some masters draw a hair-thin chalk line inside the trough, their secret tide mark, and threaten apprentices with carrot-peeling duty if they scrub it away. You don't use chalk. Your hand remembers the tide. Weights first. You set a scoop of the fine froment, ring the scale true. Then tip it into the crater you've made in the mound, a pale moon with a small sea at its center. Then the everyday blend follows, darker and honest, filling the outer circle like countryside on the horizon. Water next, poured in a slow ribbon until the sea glints, levain after, sliding in like a ladle of living weather. You pause with the salt, because salt is politics in a jar. You weigh it carefully, crumble it between finger and thumb, and let it rain where it will meet water soonest. You still toss a pinch over your shoulder for the devil's breakfast. You started as a joke, and now it's tradition, which is how most traditions get hired. Your right hand goes first, fingers splayed into a rake. You spiral slowly, drawing flour off the walls into the lake of water and starter, stirring from the center outward until paste forms and then resists, sticky and stubborn. Candlelight catches the glisten, and the room smells quickly of apple tart levain and damp wheat. You hold back a little water, because you practice what you call, with a grin, giving the dough a drink later. If some future professor wants to call it bocinage, you won't argue. Right now it's just better dough. Historians still argue whether urban bakers in this century habitually added water in stages, or preferred a single decisive mix. Recipes are shy about admitting their tricks, but your hands like the staged approach. It lets gluten plan its day. You switch to both hands, and the sound changes. Wet silk, tearing politely, then something more like a heavy cat purring. You scrape down the walls with the coupote and fold them into the center, over and over, kneading without yet kneading. More persuasion than force. You talk as you work, because dough likes to be included. You'll be fine, you tell it. You'll do your work, I'll do mine. First joke of the hour. This is the only meeting where everyone actually reads the agenda and stays on task. The candle gutters as a draft pokes its nose in from the door, then steadies, and your shadow performs its own baker's pantomime on the far wall, arms dipping, rising, turning. You check the feel constantly. You chase a texture you could find in a blindfold, cool as riverstone at first, then warmer as the levain wakes and wears the water. You hold back on speed. Haste makes lumps, and lumps make lectures from the guild, and lectures make headaches. The oven's warmth at your back is a large, patient animal saying, I'll be ready when you are. You add the held back water in 3 modest baptisms, each followed by a brief rest just to count to a dozen while gluten thinks. A breath, a stroke with the scraper to keep the bench civilized. The mass goes from shag to coherence, threads forming when you lift and drape. You listen for that faint sound like satin rubbing satin. You only hear it on good days, and today is trying to be one. Mainstream aside, tucked into the motion, salt tightens gluten and moderates fermentation, which is why you never let it ambush the levain too early. Everything has an order, even chaos. You scrape your hands clean against the dough itself, nothing wasted, and glance toward the shelf, where St. Honor's pewter face catches a fleck of candlelight. In some houses, they tuck a sliver of last year's St. Day wick into a drawer to keep the bread from losing its temper. Your drawer holds string, stamps, and the peel hook. You keep the luck where you can see it on the wall, not under it. Quirky shop habit you quietly enjoy. Before first mix on cold mornings, you rub the rim of the trough with half a clove of garlic. Does it ward off bad air, as an aunt swore, or just keep curious apprentices from tasting raw dough? Both outcomes please you. The mass now looks like what it is, a promise with elbows. You lift it and it resists, then yields. A stubborn child learning to be helpful. The cat opens one eye, decides you're at the boring part, which is everything that isn't fish, and closes it again. You give the dough a short rest, the kind you never give yourself, because you've learned the paradox. 5 minutes of nothing now saves 15 of grumbling later. You drape a damp linen over the trough, not touching the surface, only veiling the air to keep drafts polite. While it breathes, you do what bakers always do. You count invisible things. How quickly the earlier autolists shortened this mix. How much cooler the room feels now that dawn is sneaking at the shutters. Whether the starter had that extra edge of tartness this morning, you mark down a line in chalk. Batch begun. Inspectors adore chalk. So do you, when it says what you want. Back under the cloth, the surface has softened. You dip your hands, shake off the extra, and fold the edges toward the middle. Quarter turns that tidy the mass into a glossier self. You make the small cross that your master made and his master before. Is it blessing, or is it a measuring trick so you can see expansion at a glance? Historians still argue whether the cross in dough was more pious reflex than practical gauge. You're comfortable calling it both, which is a very French solution. You test a little pinch between finger and thumb and pull. It stretches before it tears. We're not at silk yet, but we're a long way from rag. The candle flares, catching its second wind like you, and you imagine it rolling its tiny shoulders and muttering, over time again. Second joke. Your candle is the only coworker who complains less than the cat. Time to consider the paperwork no one sees. Marks billing. In some quarters the authorities require a baker's sign stamped on a loaf. In your house, you mark batches with a barely different score later. A private Morse code that tells you which dough grew in which weather. Mainstream detail. Bakers' marks point cons have walked Europe for centuries. Sometimes as pride, sometimes as police report. When you lay the blade on a proofed loaf, you'll speak that quiet language. You scrape around the trough once more, gathering stragglers, and tidy the bench. The dough sits rounder now, not quite a ball, more a domed hill under cloth. You press it with the back of 2 fingers. It pushes back with modest confidence. You hum once. Catch yourself whistling as banned by a retired master, who swore it drew a mischievous wind down the fluand. Convert the tune into a breath. The oven murmurs. The fluand minds her own business. The city beyond the shutters drifts toward gray. A last swirl of the bucket catches flour dust and turns it into galaxy again, and you dip the ecovillain head just to wet it for later passes, then hang it to drip. On the sill, a sprig of bay waits for pies. You pretend it's for the mop, and let the superstition feel included. Third joke. If every superstition actually worked, you'd be out of a job. Bread would bake itself out of pure paranoia. You slide the cloth back and see the surface grow a shade smoother. And something in your shoulders remembers the rhythm to come. You'll move from persuasion to true kneading, now folding air into structure, turning sticky promise into organized dough with a future. But you don't hurry the threshold. Candlelight, warm brick, Levain's apple breath, salt's reasonable voice, the measured weight of flour. Everything has been introduced. Nobody is shouting, and even the cat agrees the meeting can proceed. You slip both hands under, lift, and lay the mass on the bench with a patient thud. The sound that means the day is truly underway. The trough breathes out, empty for a moment, and you grin at your reflection in the small shine of the scale pan flour hair, honest smudge, eyes used to dawn. The dough waits, and so do you, half a heartbeat, like a dancer poised before the music. Then the music begins. You turn the dough onto the bench and it lands with a gentle thud, a sleepy drumbeat that sets your shoulders into motion. Palms forward. You slide under and fold the near edge up and over, sealing it with the heel of your hand, the first sentence in a long, agreeable argument. The mass is cool, tacky, undecided. You are warm, sure, insistent. You rock forward, press, draw back, quarter turn. The pattern sets like song. Breath steadies, the oven hums at your back, and the fluent that she is offers, A quiet, approving sigh. The cat doesn't even open an eye. It trusts your choreography more than clocks. You keep the bench clean with a swipe of the coupote, not adding much flour, just a whisper to keep the dough honest. Too much and you'll cloud the crumb. Too little, and you'll glue yourself to your own ambition. Fold, press, turn, fold, press, turn. You stretch the top away from you, lay it over, then heel it down. Trapping air the way a fisherman traps light in a net. That air matters. It's scaffolding for tomorrow's chew. Mainstream fact: 17th-century bakers in France knead in a wooden trough called a pétrin or main, and often finish on a bench like this. Sometimes two workers encounter rhythm to move heavy doughs that weigh more than an apprentice's pride. A little slap now, the French coup de pointet and flick to tighten the skin without tearing the heart. You listen for the change. At first a wet shuffle, then a satin rub, then a muted spring. As if the dough has discovered knees and would like to dance, you pause to let it breathe. 10 beats, then back to the work. Historians still argue whether the dramatic slap and fold we love to brag about belonged to this century or settled into print in later manuals. Your shop swears by what your hands know: gentle strength, not theater. The cat, partial to theater only, when fish are casting, remains immovably unimpressed. You test elasticity between finger and thumb. It stretches farther before it complains. Good. You lift a corner and coax a thin window. Light passes through in a cloudy oval before the film yields. Not silk yet, but surely cloth. You fold north to south, east to west. The dough rounds itself, smoothing out adolescent sulks. Quirky tidbit you learned from a master with more jokes than teeth. He timed early kneading by prayers: 1 paternoster for mixing, 2 for strength, 3 if the flour was moody. No hourglass on the wall, just a rosary in his pocket, and an oven that cared more for consistency than for seconds. Heat starts to build in your arms. The bakehouse is that rare gym where the weights are edible. The membership fee is sleep. First joke: if bakers had biceps, the city would tax them. So do not flex near a window. You roll your shoulders anyway, and keep the cadence. Modest violence bruises dough. Courtesy convinces it. You pull, fold, press, turn. Hands stay parallel, wrists steady, elbows close. The ecovillain drips on its hook like a patient reed. Saint Honor on the wall pretends not to notice you bargaining with gluten like a merchant with a favorite customer. You talk to the dough as you work: quiet encouragement, mild sarcasm because it's more coachable than people. There we are, you tell it, be reasonable. You give it a sip of held back water, rubbing the surface to help it drink. Feeling stickiness return for 3 breaths. Then order reassert itself. Bask in that tiny transformation. It's the sort of victory that never makes a song but makes a profession. Second joke: your shoulders file a complaint with management. Management is the cat, who stamps the complaint with a yawn and returns it unaddressed. Texture turns the corner. The dough moves like a single creature instead of several arguing parts. You lift it with both hands and it elongates willingly. You fold and it lands with a tidy seam. You give it a classic phrasage pass, pushing small portions forward with the heel to chase lumps into truth, then gather it back up and smooth the surface with 2 quick turns. Mainstream note tucked in: by this century many city shops already prefer levain raised doughs for their keeping quality and flavor, though beer barm loaves roam in from taverns and barracks. Taste and habit pick their streets, and your street chose sour long ago. You pause, palms hovering over the skin, and feel the quiet warmth you've needed in dew. Temperature is a language without numbers here. Cool river in winter, content cat in spring, sun-warmed stone by midsummer. You aim for content cat. You press 2 fingers to the crown, and the imprint rises back slowly. Not sulking, not sprinting. Good. You shape it into a loose round and let it rest under the damp cloth for 3 dozen heartbeats so the gluten can relax. Third joke: you grant the dough a nap. You deny yourself and pretend that's altruism rather than good technique. While it sighs, you scrape in tidy. Excess flour goes back to the bin. O waste. No clumps, bench wipe to a thin sheen. You shake out the cloth, Redampen its edge, and check the oven mouth. The dome still wears that pale dusting where soot burned off. The deck gleams with the hush that promises a clean launch later. The flue hushes like a satisfied ant who finally got the last word at supper. You turn back, lift the cloth, and the dough looks calmer, more confident. The surface tighter with tiny blisters that mean your levain believes in you today. Back to the rhythm. You perform 2 sets of letter folds north over south, south over north. Rotate, east over west, west over east, tucking the edges to build a gentle interior pressure. You stand a moment and feel the compacted spring. This is not the bulk rest yet, that's the next chapter of today's conversation, but it's the hinge that lets that chapter open sweetly. Historians still argue whether 17th century loaves leaned denser because of regional weeds, or whether time and technique were already making crumbs lighter than we give them credit for. Your hands vote for patience over nostalgia. Final passes now, no heroics, only kindness, a light slap to tighten the skin, a glide of the scraper to roll the seam under. And you've got a cohesive, slightly glossy round that breathes like a contented thing. You smooth the top with a damp palm, feeling the faint tack turn to a clean glide. And smile at the small cross you'll cut later to see whether your guess about expansion was clever or lucky. You set the mass back into the trough, cover it, and rest your forearms on the rim, letting the warmth soak into tired muscle, while pretending you are thinking deep thoughts about crumb architecture. You are, a little air has met structure. Water has met flour. Salt stands guard, levain hums its old song. The dough is awake, noun, not wild, not torpid, but alert the way a city is alert just before shutters go up. Outside, delivery wheels murmur. Inside, the oven keeps its red animal patience. On the sill, that sprig of bay watches like a tiny green sentinel. You take 1 step back and breathe, easy and long, as if the room had widened by an inch. The morning, which began as embers and intention, now has weight and promise. You cover the trough and let the dough learn to speak. You settle the dough back into the trough and give the linen a soft shake, so it tense rather than kisses the surface. Bulk fermentation isn't a nap. It's a conversation you conduct with your hands in your pockets. The room's warmth is a helpful co-conspirator phone, radiating a steady kindness. Flue breathing like an ant who's finally content with everyone's life choices. You press 2 fingers to the dough's crown, feeling its memory. A gentle pushback now, which will turn to a slow, satisfied rebound later. You're listening for bubbles learning to speak. Temperature and time are the 2 unruly children of this stage. You park the trough where the oven's heat is present but not bossy. Then slide a flat board beneath one side to lift it a finger's width, your way of coaxing gases to travel. And your back's way of explaining that gravity should do some of the work. Mainstream fact to anchor this hour. In 17th century France, bakers lived by Belleslaude's prime, market and curfew, and they timed rises and firings to those public rhythms because pocket watches were rarer than honest taxman. You keep half an ear for the church down the lane. Its iron tongue is your clock's grandfather. You mark a tiny cut on the dough's skinnier cross from earlier. Then notch the inside rim of the trough with a chalk tick so you'll know exactly how much the mass swells. Not because you mistrust your hands, but because evidence silences arguments from future you. Quirky shop trick. You set a thin spruce stick the baton du pointage bridged across the trough's edges, so its shadow falls on your chalk mark. The moving shadow is a second voice telling rise from wishful thinking. An old master swore by another test. Press your ear to the dough and listen for rain on a far roof. You tried it once. The apprentice's giggles made science impossible. Waiting is honest work, which is why you don't waste it. You rinse the equivalent head and twist it dry. You sharpen the lame's little blade with 3 tender strokes. You brush flour through the linen couche to keep fibers from clinging later. The cat patrols, checks the warmest rectangle of floor, and executes a textbook, loaf-shaped nap. First joke, you consider apprenticing under the cat, whose fermentation management consists entirely of radiating confidence and demanding breakfast. You check the levain jar you fed earlier. It's domed again, bubbles catching the lantern light like tiny round mirrors. You stir it down and set it aside, not for today's batch, but because tomorrow likes to be invited a day early. Historians still argue whether most shops in this century preferred one big daily mix or staged batches to ride the oven's cooling curve. Your street's compromise is simple: a strong dawn dough, and, if the neighborhood wakes hungry, a modest noon bake that borrows warmth from pies and tarts. Either way, fermentation is the hinge that makes both doors swing. Back at the trough, you lift the cloth and the surface greets you with small blisters. A pleasant tack, a faint apple cidery perfume. You perform the first fold during bulk. You don't call it that, you call it giving the dough ideas. Hands slip under. Stretch north to south, and lay the flap gently over, then east to west, easing air through the crumb without bruising it. The mass tightens as if it remembers its spine. You turn it a quarter, cover it again, and make a modest pencil mark on your stick. Quiet bookkeeping for a living thing. A glance to the oven, dome still pale, deck still clean. You adjust the damper a thumb's width because the ant in the chimney has started humming too loudly. In winter you'd heat the water bucket against the hearth. Today the room is already generous. Mainstream aside. Folded into the moment. Cooler rooms, slow fermentation, and deep in flavor. Warmer ones, speed it and risk your morning running ahead of your customers. 17th century bakers didn't use thermometers. They used wrists, noses, and mistakes. You have all three, the first two by design. You set out bannetons, the wicker baskets that will cradle-shaped loaves later, and brush them with flour until they look like they've been dusted for fingerprints. You check the scale weights against till smug, still correct hand, take one moment to sweep the floor in a broad crescent. Because a tidy step keeps slips away when the peel starts flying. Saint Honor's medallion gets a tap as you pass. Not a prayer, exactly more, you're seeing this, right, nod. Second joke, between the saint, the cat, and the flu. You run a 3-member board of directors, and all of them are terrible at minutes. Cloth back. The dough has risen to your chalk line and is flirting with the idea of another. You give it a second set of folds. A bit firmer now, lift, stretch, drape, watching how the surface smooths and holds. Gas bubbles. Newly confident, take your rearrangement as encouragement rather than insult. You picture crumb as a city map. Alleys you're nudging into boulevards, cul-de-sacs rounding into plazas. Historians still argue whether the airy crumbs we romanticize belonged only to the elites, white loaves, or whether good technique already coaxed openness from respectable brown mixes. Your hands have seen both at parties. Between folds, you tend the quiet chores that make a day work like a well-oiled hinge. You count coin change for the shopfront. Chalk new tallies for orders from the convent and the tavern. Check the sprig of bay on the sill, still green, still pretending to be a small, leafy patron. You rub a dot of oil into the long peel's handle where a splinter threatened romance. The cat, whose job description includes ambience, changes positions without opening its eyes and somehow finds a sunbeam nobody else ordered. You hover your palm over the dough and feel a change in breath, a little warmer, a little more assertive. You wet your fingers and pinch off a tiny knob, drop it in a cup of water on the bench. It sinks, then hangs, then bobs your shop's folk gauge for almost there. Quirky tidbit. A baker you met at a St. Denis fair swore by floating a raisin in starter. When the raisin rose, the dough was ready for shaping. You tried it twice. The cat ate the raisins. The experiment entered the annals of science as inconclusive. You perform one last, gentle fold for strength, a kindness, rather than a lecture, and tuck the edges under, so tension gathers at the top. Then you leave it truly to itself. You trim a wick. You straighten the stack of paper cones for selling salt by the pinch, taxed, yes, but less likely to clump if you line the cones with a kiss of flour. You breathe in, slow and long, hearing the tiny fizz from the trough that you probably imagine and probably trust anyway. First serious truth posing as a joke. Bakers are paid to hallucinate politely about bubbles and call it scheduling. A bell out in the lane talks to the pigeons. The sky has decided it wants to be morning rather than a rumor. You let the cloth fall back and study the surface. Your cross has widened, your notch is halfway to the next tick, and the pokey test yields a slow, dignified spring. The dough is alive in the particular way you understand, not as a metaphor, but as a stack of small, comprehensible life yeasts arguing, bacteria negotiating, proteins knitting, all of them dressed as bread. Mainstream fact. Bread was so central to urban diets that authorities posted prices the tax due, pain linking loaf costs to grain markets, and inspectors could demand to see your scales and your soul on any weekday ending in day. You think about noise outside Wheeler's getting their first coffee, servants lighting kitchen fires, the watchman deciding the night did not kill him after all. You think about your own choreography. Next, you'll tip the dough out, cut portions with a steady scale eye, and set palms to shaping boules between, and a few fanciful knots if Madame Ledger's grandchildren appear with sticky coins. But you do not drift ahead. You stay here, in this hinge of the morning, because patience now buys speed later. Third joke. You tell yourself if you wait 5 more breaths, the dough will write you a thank you note. You promise to read it before the cat does. Historians still argue whether bakers slept in the bakery or above it, whether ordinances that once forbade night work still quietly bent for bread. You answer with the evidence of your own yawn. You live on these premises in all senses. Your pillow smells faintly of crust. Your coat pockets produce both coins and crumbs. Your dreams consult the flu. The day steps closer, and the dough answers in kind. Settling, expanding, finding its courage. You touch the linen one more time, the way you might smooth a child's hair before sending them to school, and feel that small hum of readiness. The oven is a held breath. The trough holds a living map. The cat purrs the minutes. You lift the chalk, draw one final tiny tick at the rim, and nod. The bubbles have learned enough language for what comes next. You lift the linen and the dough looks like a quiet hill after good rain rounded. Lively, patient, 2 fingers press the crown. The imprint returns with a slow, confident rise. Time to turn promise into parcels. You dust the bench, lightly, not a snowstorm. Just morning frost, and tip the trough with a practiced roll so the whole mass sighs out in one soft sheet. It spreads a little and murmurs the softest fizz, the sound of bubbles negotiating new borders. You smile. Negotiations are your specialty. Scale and scraper take their places. The gilt-stamped weights wink their officious little eyes, and you answer by setting the pan to 0 with a tap that says, behave. You slide the coupé under the edge and pull the first portion free. A generous handful, then another, setting each on the scale until the needle agrees with both you and the inspector. You can hear in your future. Mainstream fact to anchor the moment. Guild rules tie price to weight, and officials have been known to stride in with their own counterweights, test loaves and levy fines when bread comes up light. Your system beats embarrassment. Each piece begins exactly where the law expects it to end. Pre-shaping comes first, the gentle rehearsal before performance. You cup your hands around a portion and pull the surface toward the center, turning the mass on the bench so its skin tightens and the seams gather underneath. 1, 2 turns, then face down to rest. You do this again and again, portions into rounds, rounds into tidy, dozing planets until the bench is a constellation of small moons under a damp cloth. You give them 5, 10 minutes to forget your hands. Historians still argue whether this bench rest was consciously codified in your century or simply a habit born of heavy doughs and honest fatigue. Name or not, the pause works. When they've relaxed, you return to each in turn. For bowls, you flip around seam up, pat it into a soft square. Then fold the top third down and press with the heel to seal a spine. Left side in, right side in. Little stitches with your thumbs to keep the pressure uniform. Then roll the body toward you so the seam tightens under your palms. You drag the base gently against the bench to lock the tension, as if zipping the shape into itself, and set it seam up in a flowered banneton, where the wicker kisses flour back to the loaf. You dust the top, which is bottom for now, with a light veil. They look like sleeping hedgehogs in straw cradles. Petards next, those elegant ovals that live between round and long. You flatten a portion into a neat rectangle, fold the top edge to the middle and seal, then the bottom edge up over that seal, setting a firm central line. A gentle roll with your palms lengthens the body, tapering just enough at the ends to suggest confidence, not drama. If a seam looks mutinous, you give it the baker's stitch, thumb and forefinger walking down the line with tiny bites until it lies obedient. Quirky tidbit your first master swore by: never shape an odd number of petards if you can help it. They quarrel in the oven, and one sulks. You humor the ghost of his superstition, arranging pairs when possible, because harmony is cheaper than therapy. Each shaped loaf finds its bed. Bowls and bannetons seam up petards on the linen couche, where you pull up a flowered pleat between neighbors to keep the shoulders from sticking. The bench looks like a small parade ground. You are the drill sergeant with very soft orders. First joke, you call them petards with affection, but still reassure them they're legitimate in your eyes. No loaf left behind. You keep the scale close and the weights cleaner than your conscience on market day. Portions for the convents, big Mitches run heavier. Those sisters feed a small army of quiet appetites, while Madame L. Erguer prefers to modest bowls for the table and the pocket, meaning one is for show and the other for the kitchen. You notch a tiny mark on the rim of a basket to tell the shop from the orders. Later, when scoring, you'll speak in that code with the blade. Mainstream detail tucked in. Baker's marks and characteristic scores help customers recognize their house and help inspectors trace responsibility. A crooked loaf can earn you a crooked look, and those live longer than crust. You settle into the rhythm that makes shaping feel like a lullaby with elbows. Palms roll, fingers tuck, seams seal with the right kind of insistence. You keep the bench whisper floured and lift crumbs with the scraper so no grit tears the delicate surface tension. You're building. The oven's warmth grazes your shoulders. The fluent purrs approval. The cat relocates to the couche's end and watches with the proprietary air of a foreman who never touches lumber. Second joke. You tell it, if you shape 3 bowls, I'll double your pay. And it answers with a blink that bills you for insolence. Now and then a dough fights you, spreading as if auditioning for a rug. You reply with patience, not scolding folds that stack strength, a firmer seal, a slightly longer bench drag to pull the skin taut. If a petard's end looks sulky, you twist it half a turn against the surface to teach it manners. You know when to stop. The dough skin should be tight as a drum you'd play only with a feather. Overwork now, and the proof will limp later. Underwork and scores won't bloom. They'll sulk. Historians still argue whether the word petard for this shape was widespread in the 17th century or stabilized later in writing. Bakers, being practical poets, have used nicknames as long as hands have touched dough. You'll call it what your master called it, and pass the name on the same way by repetition, not decree. You sprinkle the couche with an extra breath of flour where the ovals will sit. Linen likes to pretend it isn't clingy until it is. Banneton rows, grow. You pattern their positions so the first shaped is the first baked, a quiet cue that saves you from your future self. The room smells greener now, wheat and apple and the faint wicker sweetness of damp baskets. You test a bowl by turning the basket a little. It slides like a polite guest. Good. You brush excess flour off the bench. Into your palm no waiststand, rub it into the handle of the peel, where someone's sweaty panic might need it later. Not yours, obviously. Somebody else's. Requests filter through your memory while your hands do their math. 3 small rounds to the tavern. 2 ovals, to the widow with the steady smile. 1, Mitch for your own table, which is really for your apprentices, because you will probably eat standing up like a stork with crumbs. You make 1 teacher loaf, a slightly larger bowl with a longer seam, so you can later slice it to show crumb without robbing the shop. You set aside a scrap bowl for pâté fermenti, tomorrow's flavor tucked into today's cleanup, because thrift is the backbone of taste. You keep checking tension. A gentle press on a bull's shoulder gives a modest spring and holds a fingerprint for just a breath. That memory tells you it will proof with dignity. You dust each with a soft snowfall, not for taste but for ceremony and to guide the blade later. The lame waits keen and smug, but its hour hasn't rung yet. You lean a banneton toward the oven and feel heat brush your knuckles. Good proof will be steady, not sleepy. You pull the cloth up in soft hills between batards, a tiny landscape that keeps cousins from merging into politics. The cat decides one basket is mildly warmer than another and relocates with the expression of a customer who just wants to see the other size. You deny it a banneton with the same unruffled tone you use on inspectors. Third joke, you promise the cat a managerial promotion to head of crumb evaluation, which is a title it already claims without the paperwork. A pleasant, almost ceremonial minute arrives. Dusting hands, you step back to look. The bench is an ordered map. The city outside is properly awake. Now cartwheels, cobbles, a hawker's early call, but your little field has its own calm. Bulls nap in their willow nests. Batards line up on their linen avenue wearing flower-like shy makeup, your shoulders lower. This part of the day is always a hush, like the held pause after the orchestra tunes and before the first downbeat. Mainstream fact, to tuck at the end of your sleeve. In this century many households buy bread daily, and many buy big mitches as heavy as a toddler, feed families for days, their crust turning stew into meal, their slices into labor's fuel. Your shapes this morning serve both the daily and the durable, the breakfast and the broth. The oven remembers. The bricks hold their ready heat, and your hands smell like the beginning of lunch. You mark the sequence in your head, and, for certainty, with a tiny chalk fleck on the edge of the table, first row, second row, convent, tavern, shop. Later, when the blade draws its quick grammar across each skin, you'll read those marks, and the loaves will answer in steam. For now, you lift the cloth just enough to keep drafts polite, give Saint Honor's little pewter a tap as you pass, and feel the room lean with you toward the oven's mouth. The parade is formed. The next command is heat. You set the proofing boards in a neat runway along the warm side of the bench, and pull the linen couché into soft flowered hills. The fabric has a particular hand to it, cool, slightly waxy from years of flour. The way well-loved pages feel, in a prayer book, and you dust it with a calm snow so the loaves will rise without clinging. Linen likes a compliment. You give it one by rubbing a little bran into the weave, where batards will sit. Insurance against enthusiasm. Bulls sleep in their wicker cradles, seam up, each basket lined with a square of cloth that smells faintly of flax and clean dust. You lower the first row into place, tucking a pleat of linen high between neighbors so the shoulders don't kiss and stick. The dough's skin that you tightened a minute ago now learns to relax with dignity, not flop. The surface loosens like a polite smile, and you can feel tension distributing from crown to heel. You give each loaf a fingertip, nudge barely pressure-reading its mood the way a barber reads stubble. The bench hushes. The oven radiates its animal kindness. Somewhere behind the chimney, a pigeon says something indecisive, and then thinks better of it. Mainstream fact, slipped between folds. French bakers in your century prize linen for this work. Flax cloth woven in provinces that know how to pull thread from plant and make it behave. The couché keeps shape, wicks a whisper of moisture from the dough's skin, and leaves those faint, handsome ridges you've seen on loaves like fingerprints. Wicker baskets do their part too, holding bowls steady while the crumb maps itself for the oven to read. You set a board across two stools to make another lane, and move the later batch there, because patience needs real estate. The fluent hums a quiet alto. You answer by nudging the damper the width of a thumbnail, to keep the room in that sweet band between drowsy and fretful. Historians still argue whether 17th century shops kept a separate puss, room heated gently for proofing, or simply used the bakehouse's lingering warmth. Every street writes its own manual. Your manual says, park the couché where your knuckles like to be. A glance inside the baskets. The seams sit snug, little topographies of your earlier folds. You sprinkle the rims with a touch of flour so nothing will protest at turnout. Then lift a bannock an inch, and set it down again to feel the weight settle. The dough answers with a small sigh, the good kind. Not the teenager kind, and you nod as if you just concluded a satisfactory treaty. The cat hops onto its usual throne, the coolest end of the longest board, circles twice, and becomes a supervisory croissant. First joke. You tell it this area is for premium clients, and it blinks the way only VS presidents of napping can blink. You kneel to check the EQ villain, wringing the mop head and dunking it again so the cloth will throw a polite steam when you sweep the deck just before loading. Steam, you tell the loaves, is your first applause. They don't laugh, which is fair, but they do rise with a little more confidence as the room's air leans warmer. You rub a touch of flour on the peel's lip, so the slide later will be a slide, not a lesson in gravity's temper. Quirky shop habit your master swore by. He kept a black-headed pin tucked into the edge of the linen, to prick the evil eye if it peers at the bench. You do not share this with inspectors. Pins and loaves are better acquaintances than friends. The finger dent test becomes your mantra. You press the shoulder of a bull with 2 fingers and count 1, 2, 3 indent holds, then rounds slowly, not ready yet for the blade's grammar. Give it a few more whispered minutes. A batard farther down springs back faster. You turn its basket a quarter turn to even warmth and pull the linen up so a breeze can mind its own business. A tiny spritz of water ghosted over the couche on dry days keeps skin from forming too early. Today the air is generous, and the dough glows with that faint apple peel shine Levain loves to wear. Mainstream aside to keep on the bench. Proofing too long makes loaves slouch and cuts their oven spring. Too short and scoring rips like a dramatic letter opener. Guildmen won't weigh your proof, but they will weigh outcomes. And outcomes pay the rent. You angle a board closer to the oven mouth so the first row can bask. The dome inside wears that chalky pale from burned soot. The deck gleams faintly where your mop passed earlier, signs you've tamed the beast for now. Outside, a vendor drags his fowl through the lane, selling onions. Thuds of barrels at the tavern say the day wants to be loud. In here, loud belongs to flour dust when it lands on linen like soft rain. You press your ear to the nearest basket as if it's a seashell. Do you hear a fizz? Maybe it's your own secret wish humming. Second joke. You pretend to take notes. Do reports favorable weather, so the cat will respect your scholarship. You drift your palm a hair's breadth above each loaf, feeling radiated cool and stored warmth. The difference tells you which will be first to bloom under the blade. You plan scores in your head, a cross that will open like a modest flower on the bowls. A long ear for the cut shallow and swift so it lifts like a shrug. You touch the lame's handle, no flourish. The steel remembers arrogance and set it down again. Not yet. A good score begins in proofing, not at the blade. Historians still argue whether bakers in this period dusted with pure wheat flour alone, or favored bran and rye to reduce sticking. Manuscripts are tidy about piety and stingy about tricks. Your hands learned the mixed method from an old woman who could calm a dough by talking about weather. You keep her recipe in your wrists. You also keep her superstition. The first banneton of the day gets a single flax thread laid under the cloth to remind the loaf where it came from. The thread never knows it was heroic. You do. You give the whole bench the gift of stillness for a minute, no touching. No tiding because proofing likes to feel unobserved. The loaves rise almost visibly now, shoulders easing, small bubbles drifting upward to test the skin. You think of yesterday's chalk marks and how today's will echo them. Bread is memory with crust. A bell rings out on the corner. Your inner clock sets its hands to almost. You lift one basket. The loaf releases cleanly from the cloth with a confident little shrug. Good. The couche has done its work, the fabric wicking just enough, the pleats keeping neighbors honest, the boards holding discipline without noise. You find the one that has been flirting hardest with readiness. A neat batard whose side feels like a drum stretched yesterday. The poke gives you a patient dent and a promise. You add it to the first wave queue and glance at the oven mouth. The fluent breathes the way you like her to breathe. The deck is calm. Saint Honor's pewter medallion winks from its nail as if it loves a good schedule. Third joke. You tell the saint to clock in for his shift. The cat, unionized, declines over time. The apprentices still hypothetical this hour would be flouring boards and humming. In their absence, you do both. Hum soft, flour softer. You brush loose flour off the linen with the back of your hand. Too much flour roasts bitter on a hot deckhand. Pat the cloth back into pleats where it has flattened under ambition. You rotate 2 baskets again because hot spots are like gossip. They start where you least need them. One last circuit. Shoulders springing politely. Crowns, round but not proud. Seams holding. Skin neither sticky nor dry. A satin that will take a quick blade and bloom rather than tear. You breathe long, slow, the way you ask customers to breathe when they decide between bulls and batards. Mainstream detail to pocket before the rush. Many towns post the tax due pane bread price bands tied to grain rates on public boards. Proofing may be private art, but sale is public arithmetic. Your arithmetic today promises both decency and crust. You lay the first launching board crosswise at bench height, a half step from the oven, and nest the first wave beside it. The peel waits, light in the hands, lip dusted and sure. The room tilts a fraction toward action, but you keep your voice low inside your skull. Steady on. Steady on. Proof is a held breath you release at exactly the right time. You lift a basket, invert with a single roll of the wrists, and feel the loaf's weight land cleanly on the board. It sits there, flour-kissed and ready, like a sentence that knows its verb. The bench, linen, wicker, and quiet have done their part. You give the cloth a grateful shake, as if thanks could be dusted. The loaves listen. So does the oven. The next motion will be steel through skin and the softest gasp of steam. But for 2 heartbeats more, you let the silence be a cushion. Then you reach for the lame. The lame rests in your palm like a small, clever secret. You angle the blade until it catches a ribbon of light, then let your shoulders drop. This part is breath and grammar. The first petard waits on the launching board, skin taut from proof, flour dusting its face like stage powder. You bring steel to dough at a shallower angle than newcomers. Think almost laying the blade against the surface and draw a quick, confident line from shoulder to heel. The cut smiles open a little at once. That's the door you've built your morning around. Marks are not vanity, they're language. Mainstream fact, to pin to the bench. In many French towns, bakers carried distinctive poinçons, marks or patterns, so customers and inspectors could tell one house's bread from another. And fines or praise could find the right address. Your house speaks in a modest cross for bulls and a single, long ear for batards, with tiny variations that only you and the ledger understand. The blade doesn't dig, it glides, almost whispering, so the cut lifts later rather than sulking flat. You adjust for the second batard. A touch deeper at the start. A hair lighter at the end. A 30-ish degree tilt so the future ear can rise and shelter a stripe of pale, sweet crumb. You don't chase prettiness. You set tension free where it wants to open. The dough is already expanding, curious about the future. You simply show it the proper door. First joke, if scoring were calligraphy. Your hand is a polite parish clerk, not a swashbuckling poet, because poets make crumbs you can read through. Bulls take a different conversation. You invert the first onto the board, seam now down, dust off excess flour, and draw a small cross that meets in the middle without bullying the crown. Sometimes, for the convent's mitch, you add a wheat sheaf the empire to short chases branching from one long stem. Inspectors will never fine you for a pretty sheaf, but they will fine you for a collapsed one. Function is the parent, decoration is the politely behaved child. Historians still argue whether 17th century scoring leaned mostly praedicatium, relief and baker's mark, or whether decorative patterns were already common beyond feast breads. Manuscript images insist on modesty, while regional pride insists on flourish. You wipe the blade clean on your apron between cuts, not from squeamishness, but to keep tacky bits from dragging. A quirky shop trick some masters swear by, a goose feather, kept in a jar on the shelf. Used to brush the cut just as you finish so no strands cling, and the ear lifts like a well-bred greeting. Your feather has outlived 2 aprons and a saint's day. You touch it to the line and the dough thanks you by not arguing. Loaders and peels now. You dust the peels, lip only the lip. Excess flour tastes like ash when it burns, and give it a test slide under the first scored petard. The wood hums quietly where it meets the bench. You check the angle of your wrists. Too high and you'll stretch the shape, too low and you'll hesitate. Hesitation is how you invent new words for oops. The oven mouth glows like a tame sunrise. The deck waits, clean and slightly damp from the Iku villain-esque kiss. Second joke. If the peel were a violin, you'd be a Baker Paganini, except your concert ends with applause. You can butter. You lift, not really lifting, more a forward promise. Let the loaf skim the board, and with a small practiced jab, send it gliding from wood to stone. The sound it makes is the softest hush, like an agreement signed. You aim for the back left corner first, then back, populating the edges to keep the mouth cool and to make room for the rest. Bakers give names to oven geography. The back wall's shadow, the left cheek, the right cheek, the mouth's drafty lip. You know your vault's microclimates the way a shepherd knows hills. Another petard, another clean glide, then a pull. Your wrist gives a tiny check to avoid flattening the round. You keep your body close, movements small and sure. The oven respects calm. The fluent breathes steadily above. And you resist an old apprentice's superstition to whistle for luck. No whistling in the bakehouse. An elderly master said it summons a mischievous wind, and you don't argue with the weather. You do, however, count under your breath, a baker's rosary of placements. 1 left, 1 right, 1 center, then 2 along the back, to balance heat. Between glides, you swab the deck once with the equivalon, water heavy but not dripping, to wake a little steam for the next pair. Steam is friendly today. Yesterday it wanted attention. You keep the door your wooden bouchon by to rest against the mouth. Between batches so the vault holds its breath but never sulks. Mainstream aside tucked into the motion. Without early steam, crust sets too soon and loaves spring less. With it, cuts bloom and the skin lacquer forms glossy and strong. You don't lecture the oven about physics. You offer it a damp cloth and say, be kind. The cat has installed itself 3 feet from danger, with a view that suggests ownership. You tell it this is a no-tail zone, and it rotates its loaf-shaped nap 90 degrees to comply without actually moving. Third joke, the cat later writes you up for unsafe peel operation under failure to provide fish. You accept the citation and continue loading. Baskets empty and boards clear in a rhythm you could dance if you had more knees. Each turn from bench to mouth is a small bridge of attention. Check angle, read proof memory in the skin. Respect the score's direction, glance at the deck, commit. Hesitation lives exactly in that last word. You practice banishing it by breathing out as you jab the peel forward. Exhale equals launch. Inhale equals reset. Apprentices try to muscle this part. You know better. It's wrists and breath, not biceps. If biceps were taxed, remember, you would hide them under another apron. You keep back 1 teacher loaf, the demo bowl 2, go in a tad later. It will be your crumb slice at the counter without robbing the queue. You also slide in 2 small panes, pour Angfang's little rounds for Madame Ledger's grandsons because customers remember. Kindness even when inspectors forget. A quick look at your chalk mark on the table edge tells you the sequence still holds. First shaped are first baked. The ledger in your head matches the ledger in your drawer. As the first wave sits, you sweep the deck's bare patches 1 more time. Not for cleanliness alone, but to raise 1 more puff of steam. Teeny applause for the latecomers. The door plug leans in. You never seal the mouth hard. This oven likes to be kissed, not clamped. Historians still argue whether shops in this period deliberately engineered steam trays of water, soaked rags, even splashes to the deck, or relied mostly on dough moisture and the mop. Your street uses the mop and a disciplined door, mostly because you have better aims for buckets than boiling them. Peel work becomes a trance. Board, slide, place, board, slide, place. You fix a small snag before it exists by popping a fingertip under a loaf that hesitates and flicking it into the last inch of glide. You never shove. You never sigh too loudly. You keep your weight forward like a question that expects a yes. The oven nods, the loaves settle. Scores sit like closed fans waiting to open. After the last of the first wave, you lower the peel, roll your shoulders, and give Saint Honora's medallion a tap with the back of your knuckle. Not a prayer, exactly more a did you see that? The pewter shines a bit in the heat shimmer, as if it's been paying attention all along. You check the peel's lip for any clingy flour. Brush it off with the feather is smug, and turn to the remaining proofing loaves. They answer your poke with that perfect polite dent. The bench has timed itself to your fire. You score the next pair of petards with slightly shorter lines, ovens hotter near the mouth and you don't want overreach your ears. And quick mark a bowl for the tavern with the tiny notch that says slice for tasting. Customers will lean on the counter to watch you later. Pretend not to notice the crumbs steam fog their noses, and buy two when they planned for one. The peel slides again. The board hums. You glide each piece to its little province of heat. Fill the middle lanes and leave a river of air between ranks so circulation doesn't argue. When the last loaf of this wave takes the stone with that quiet agreeableness you chase, you settle the bouchon more firmly, ease the damper until the ant in the flue hums at a lower note, and step back with the very particular satisfaction of a throw well thrown. You're not baking yet, not truly. That's the oven's line to speak next, but the sprint from bench to vault is over. Scored skins wait, tension relieved exactly where you offered relief. Loaves hold their proud, patient shape. The room smells faintly of damp linen and courage. You lay the lame aside, slide the empty baskets into a neat stack, and give the couche a shake so it forgets the impression of success and can be ready for the next ambition. The cat opens one eye in the universal language of good. Do it again. You answer with a small bow to your 3-member board of directors, Saint. Flue, catand, let your breath lengthen for the first time since you lifted the blade. The final dash is done. The oven door smiles a warm, secret smile. You rest the peel against the wall, hands still remembering the glide. And listen to the soft hush behind the bouchon. That means the next chapter is already beginning. You rest the bouchon against the mouth, and the oven inhales politely. A low, steady hush that carries damp from the equivalent into the vault. Steam lifts in a soft bloom, glazes the scored lines, and you feel the skin of the loaves loosen in exactly the way you asked it. 2 scores yawning. Ears beginning to wake. You say nothing out loud because this is the minute when silence bakes better than speeches. The fluent hums her agreeable contralto. You nudge the damper a breath so she keeps the tune steady. Steam is your first applause, and you let it play. You give the door a firmer lean and count. Not seconds breaths, 1 to 5. The first spring, a hush that turns into the softest creak as crust stretches. 6 to 10, ears lift on the petards, like little caps doffing themselves. The cross on a bowl opens into a 4-petaled flower. 11 to 15. The skin takes the first hint of sheen that will later harden to lacquer. You peep with the turning peel, the round head of it sliding under a corner to check for overage or browning, then retreat, allowing the vault to keep its secret heat. First joke, you think of steam as the oven's skincare routine open pores. Dewy glow though, you promise never to say that to the guild. You listen. Some bakers swear they hear a faint murmur when spring is right, a kind of wooden sigh from the deck, a soft complaint from dough learning its new shape. You pretend you don't, but you do. The Pele becomes your conductor's baton. You reach to the back left your ovens, sunny sea-tanned, nudge a petard a palm width to the shade. Oven geography is a map you redraw in heat. Cheeks, crown, mouth lip, shadow. The door never fully seals. You give it the kiss it likes, so steam persists without sulking. Mainstream fact, to lay like a brick, in 17th century France. Bread grades divide by flour and finish pain blank, from bolted wheat for the well-heeled pain bis, with more bran for most tables, and metal, the honest mix of wheat and rye, common in provinces where fields speak both languages. Color wasn't just vanity. It telegraphed grain and price. You watch color arrive, now first blonde where the dome lends the gentlest rays, then honey along the ears, then a hint of chestnut at the bull's lips where the cross begins to curl. You count another slow set before the first turn. The turning peel, long-handled, round-headed, slides in like a moon on a stick. You lift and pivot, not from the wrist alone but from shoulders and hips, so the loaf spins on its axis without skidding. Quarter turn for each botard, half turn for each bull. Your vault bakes more evenly than most. But bricks have loyalties, and you court them with symmetry. Historians still argue whether most bakers of your century turned loaves mid-bake as formal practice, or left the vault to do its work untouched. You learned rotation from a master who distrusted any heat he couldn't see, and made better bread because of it. Steam has done its generous work. You ease the bouchon, open a finger so some escapes and crust can set like armor. Ears begin to curl, grigs that will hold their pale stripe when the rest goes mahogany. You grin at the first petard to get its handsome profile. You will never admit how much pride you take in a good ear. How you've judged distant cousins for less. Second joke, you consider writing a tiny performance review for St. Honor. Consistent results, good attitude, minor issues with overtime, but you tap the pewter medallion instead, and call it even. The smell changes, and that tells you more than sight. It goes from wet wheat and apple to toast, then from toast to a warm sugared nut note that lives somewhere between almond and barley tea. That scent warns you that color can accelerate while your back is turned. You pass the ecovillain dry across the bare stones at the mouth, not to wet them now, but to sweep away any ghost flour that might scorch, then slide the turning peel beneath. The teacher loaf to peak. The bottom shows a pleasant lepering, neither pale nor so bold it will taste of ash. Good, another quarter turn to grant the shy side some sun. Quirky tidbit, the kind that wears an apron stitched by superstition. An old neighbor would slip a single straw into the oven mouth and time how quickly it browned the saint's second hand. She called it and swear that loaves pulled with straws, counsel kept longer. You tried it once, the cat stole the straw. You learned nothing except that cats admire innovation they can nap on. Edges deepen, a petard at the back right lingers to blonde. You draw it forward and send a more cocky loaf to that seat. A mitch for the convent shows the first telltale crack along an old fold you'd hoped would stay quiet. You accept it as personality and turn the flaw into flourish by aiming it toward the mouth where it'll brown handsomely. Crusts begin to harden and their tiny fissures release. The hiss you love, the bread's singing while it still holds heat enough to speak. You hear it even through the door's patient lean, a chorus you pretend is only physics, but also accept as encouragement. You lean the bouchon out another inch to vent, letting the vault grow a shade drier so the lacquer cures the color chart in your head. Blonde, honey, amber, chestnut, mahogany clicks forward a notch. Preference is a local dialect. Historians still argue whether 17th century palates favored pale. Quicker bakes lighter and easier to chew, the deeper bean cuet that keeps well and kisses stew with a darker toast. Your street likes truth in the middle. Crust with resonance, crumb that forgives teeth but resists soup long enough to matter. You draw one test bowl, invert it on your palm, and wrap the bottom with a knuckle. Hollow, but not hollow enough. The sound should be a small chapel rather than a pantry. Back in it goes, turn to aim its palest cheek at your oven's sun. You smile at the scores, bloom the cross, now a little flower with curled edges, and at the ear on a petard that has opened clean, leaving a cream-colored understripe like a secret kept. First joke was skincare. Third arrives now. You tell the loaves you hope they're photogenic today. Because nothing stings the professional soul like a dull ear in front of a chatty inspector. One more pass with the turning peel gentle, sure, and you decide the first wave is ready to leave fire for air. You open the mouth wide and the room exhales with the oven. Heat walks out to meet you. You squint because even practiced eyes respect it. Peel in, pick 2 petards at once. Withdraw in a smooth glide, and land them on the cooling rack with the softest thock. You could swear you feel the vibration in your bones. A bowl follows, then another, then the mitch, carried like a drowsy anchor. The rack greets them with space and air. You never crowd cooling crusts, need room to sing. They sing. Tiny rapid crackles chase one another across surfaces as steam flees and sugar gloss hardens. If you put your ear near you do, it sounds like a summer hedge, alive with invisible insects. You don't tell anyone you listen this closely. You simply adjust the damper and retrieve the rest. The second wave comes out a shade darker. Your oven likes to show off once it's confident and you let it. Mahogany is a good suit when the ears are clean. Mainstream aside, folded into the steam. City statutes in many towns keep one eye on fire risk, and bakehouse chimneys draw attention because everything you do is, frankly, a managed blaze. Inspections don't ask whether bread sings. They ask whether flues are clean and doors sit right and coals are banked with manners. You're on good terms with soot, which helps. You cull 2 loaves for tasting at the counter, the teacher bowl and the best-eared. Betardin set them apart where their scent will do quiet marketing later. You set the mitch for the convent on its own board so it won't squash smaller neighbors. Mass has opinions. The cat arrives with the air of a dignitary who missed the ribbon cutting, but will happily step in for photos. You tell it to keep its whiskers to itself. It obliges by supervising from an inch away. Second joke already landed. Third used. You still let yourself smirk when the cat noses the cooling rack, yanks back from the heat, and pretends it was conducting an experiment. Back in the vault, bare stones show a few flour freckles. You sweep them clean for the next run, pastries and pies that will ride the afterglow. You draw the bouchon aside and let the ant in the chimney sing in a higher register to clear any sulky eddies. Loaves on the rack keep crackling. You brush excess flour off one bowl's shoulder to reveal the golden skin under the dust, the way a sculptor releases form from stone. You wait for the last of the first wave to finish its quiet chorus, and then test crumb with your nose alone, the place where heat meets vinegar, sweet levain. It tells you guessed right on water and patience today. It tells you your starter woke in a good mood. It tells you shopfront bells are about to ring and coins will start having opinions. You lay a palm gently on the mitch's cooling dome. Warmth radiates like a low sun and pull your hand back before you're tempted to slice too early. Slicing hot is a sin you commit only to educate the young and seduce the undecided. A final look at color. A row of blondes for those who like gentler chew. A row of chestnuts for stew nights. A ribbon of betards with tidy ears all pointing the same way, like soldiers who actually listened. Somewhere in the proofing lane 2 latecomers have crept to readiness. The oven holds enough heat to treat them kindly. You oblige, score, slide, steam with a last polite swab, and let them join the day's grammar. The bakehouse smells like a city deciding to be kind. You lift the shutter's bar with your elbow because your hands are bread and your elbows don't mind work. Bells somewhere agree. Steam thins, crust hardens, coins rehearse their clink. You turn toward the front, where voices will arrive with orders, gossip, and the small theater of choosing. The rack behind you keeps singing, soft as a lullaby with a crust. You lift the shutters, and the morning slides in like warm butter bells, chiming 2 streets over. Cartwheels editing the cobbles with their usual punctuation, a sparrow making managerial comments from the signboard. Cool air kisses the racks. Hot crust answers with that faint, proud crackle. You set the tasting board on the counter, the teacher, bowl halved so its crumb smiles. The best-eared betard with a sliver friedened, the room acquires a new gravity. People come to where bread is. The first footsteps are always the quick ones. A kitchen maid with a basket, and the determined face of someone entrusted with breakfast. A mason whose hands carry the story of yesterday's wall. A boy sent from the widow's house clutching to Sue's and the instruction not too dark. You greet each with the same low-voiced cadence you use for dough and cats. The knife slides, the crust gives, the hinge squeaks, because hinges like to be heard. You lay a slice of warm crumb on the board, break it from the bark with your thumbs, and pass it across. Coins loosen when crumbs are free. Charity begins at the tasting tray. Mainstream fact to hang above the cash drawer. Your town posts the tax due pain-regulated prices tied to grain markets, and the baker's corporation keeps a suspiciously accurate scale. Loaves are not just food. They're civic math. A chalked table by the till carries today's equivalences in livre tournois and sous. So much for a bull of froment. So much for the honest brown that keeps a laborer's back straight through stone and mud. You don't argue with the tariff. You argue with the clock, the oven, and occasionally the cat. You weigh around for the maid. She watches the needle like a hawk with excellent manners, then tip it a breath heavier, because breakfast has opinions and you like making friends who return. She wraps it in the cloth she brought, tucking the steam in like a secret. The mason asks for one with shoulders. Your cue for a batard with a proud ear and a chestnut coat. You oblige, tap the crust with the back of the knife so it sings, and he grins as if you'd told him a joke. Speaking of which, first joke of the morning. You call the tasting board market research, and the mason calls it good manners. Both of you correct. Apprentice, you do not have yet imaginary but promising would be tallying a slate for household accounts. In its absence, your own hand goes to the chalk. You mark credit for the convent settled weekly in a tidy fistful of respect and coin. Count out Madame Ledger as habitual to small bulls, the table and the pocket. And notch an order for the tavern. 6 rounds now, 6 more if your afterglow cooperates. You cut the heel the quignon from a loaf and slide it to the widow's boy, because that's what heels are for. And because quignons recruit customers who grow up into customers. The door rings and gossip arrives, wearing an apron. A laundress passes coins like hot stones and asks whether the river will behave today. You tell her you've trained the river personally and she snorts, the sound of someone who trusts you with bread but not with hydrology. She wants slices. You oblige with neat half-moons for dunking into whatever pot is honest in her kitchen. Quirky tidbit you learned from an old clerk who smelled faintly of ink and hunger. People use yesterday's crumb to erase charcoal lines on drafts and ledgers. You mention it to the laundress. She nods and says, "So that's why my little one's homework tastes of crust." Mystery solved. Scholastic hunger unmasked. Business is a steady braid of coin, cloth, and how's your mother? A servant from the hotel over by the square wants 3 fine bowls for the ladies' breakfast trays. You select paler loaves and hold them a heartbeat longer so their steam thins. Trays like grace, not fog. A carter shoulders in, asks for 2 mitches for the road, and sets a wedge of cheese on the counter as if it's legal tender. You accept it as a bribe payable to your noon stomach. Historians still argue whether the so-called moral economy of the crowd truly constrained bakers' margins in the 17th century, or if that tidy theory fits better a century later. From behind this counter the rule is simpler. Make the bread fair, keep the weight honest, and the street remains kind. Your cat, having completed supervisory duties at the cooling rack, claims the left window where sun and fame meet. Children in the lane tap the glass, and the cat pretends to read the posted prices. Second joke. You inform it that window positions are rented by the quarter hour. It deducts the fee from the imaginary salary you also don't pay. Saint Honor watches from his nail, near the oven mouth. You tap the pewter face in passing, the way you'd tap a friend's shoulder in a crowded market. Inspectors have not yet materialized, but you assemble your smile that says weigh anything you like, and your scale that says I already did. Your knife slides through a batard at the counter, and the exposed crumb shows tidy. Irregular eyes, no mouse holes, no pudding, just the map you argued for at dawn. You offer a sample to a customer who swore they were only looking. They bite, blink, and become only buying. Bread makes converts with fewer pamphlets than most causes. You wrap loaves in paper cones for those who forgot cloth. Lace a string around the convent's mitch with a flourish, because nuns pretend not to enjoy flair, and always secretly do, and stack coins in shallow saucers. Sous here, deniers there. A stray foreign piece that will buy exactly 1 story later. Mainstream aside, whispered into the coin dish, in a century where bread often supplies the majority of calories for the poor, a price rise isn't just arithmetic, it's riot tinder. You keep prices you're given, and loaves that last, because you like windows without stones, and mornings without soldiers. A courier breezes in with the self-importance of a sparrow, and asks for whatever travels well. You give him a batard with a dark jacket and tell him to keep it vertical in the satchel. He assures you he will, and you try to believe him. A cartman calls from the door for 2 now, 2 after I unload, which is cartman, for I will forget the second 2, and send my cousin instead. You lay the pair aside anyway. Generosity to cousins has kept more ledgers solvent than accountants like to admit. On the tasting board, the teacher loaf shrinks as your knife offers evidence to the skeptical and comfort to the undecided. You show crumbs to a little girl with a ribbon like a flag. See how the holes are all different sizes. That means the dough had a good conversation. She nods as if you've explained the moon. Her grandmother buys a small bowl, then buys another, because the first looked lonely, which is customer for I remembered soup. Street noise lifts and settles. The fluent keeps her hum. The oven's afterglow warms the shop, the way a good memory warms a tricky day. You stow the last of the first wave in baskets under the counter and rotate newer loaves to the front where their color reads better against the light. A tinker lingers near the door and pretends he came for the cat. He leaves with a heel and a plan to come back at noon with a tail. You allow this exchange rate. Second slice of humor for you, because the morning is long. You call your chalk the white quill and vow to write a sonnet to accurate tear weight. The boy from the widow's house hears only accurate cake weight and lights up with scandalized hope. You correct him gently and slide him one last crumb. Somewhere, a church bell adds a new note to the braid. Somewhere, an inspector remembers breakfast. You keep the counter as neat as a ledger, and the talk as warm as the oven's breath. Behind it all, small domestic rituals keep rhythm. A damp cloth across the board. A brush of flour off the edge. A quick straighten of the price placard when the cat's tail edits it. You tuck 2 ends aside the cold-dew panes for a stonemason, who'll swap them for a rumor about repairs to the city gate. You tie a ribbon around a festival loaf for a woman, who says her daughter is learning to chew, and could use encouragement resembling pastry. Third joke, gift wrapped in honesty. You advise a gentleman to squeeze the loaf gently, to test freshness. He squeezes like a wrestler. The loaf squeaks. You extract it and suggest 2 fingers, not 2 ambitions. He blushes, buys 3, and promises to reform. By mid-morning, the rush becomes a hum. The rack behind you is slimmer. The coin saucers fatter. The tasting board a persuasive memory. You notch one last chalk mark beside convent. Their runner will be along soon and fold a paper cone for salt because somebody always asks and the gabelle always answers. You feel the day tilt toward its next duties, papers too tidy, oven to coax into pie temper. A delivery basket to load, but you stay in this soft theater another minute. The knifes scrape, the crumbs sigh, the coins tiny applause. A bell farther off, a shift in light, and you know the inspector will appear by noon, or not at all. If he comes, your scales will tell the story you prefer, and your loaves will sing the chorus he can't argue. If he doesn't, the street is your only judge, and the street can be kind when the bench is honest. You hand a last quignon to a child. Straighten the window sign the cat has partially reinterpreted, and let the morning's warm arithmetic conclude in a small pile of sous, a clean board, and a shop that smells like inside jokes and crust. You wipe the counter with a damp cloth and the morning redraws itself into ledgers and laws. Coins click into their saucers, the tasting board retires with crumbs like confetti, and you pull the wooden stool to the little desk where arithmetic wears an apron. The cat follows and becomes your legal counsel, by which you mean it sits on the nearest page and blinks as if billing by the stare. The oven hums an agreeable alto afterglow warming the spine of the room, while you lay out the day's papers, flour receipts, salt tallies, the chalked equivalences for the tax due pain, and the guild book with its tidy parade of dues and signatures. You run your thumb along the edge of the scale pan until it squeaks faintly. Guild-stamped weights weighed in their box like polished arguments. 1, 2, half, quarter, all bearing the mark of the last official who frowned at them. Mainstream fact to nail to the desk. In 17th-century towns, the Bakers' Corporation, the Corporation des Ballingers, sits inside the city's larger body of regulated trades. Prices are posted. Loaf weights are tied to grain costs. Inspectors, jurors, guards make their rounds with proprietary eyebrows and small, smug scales. You don't resent them. You plan for them. Resentment makes math sloppy, and sloppy math makes fines. Salt next. You lift the lidded jar with 2 hands as if it holds something more volatile than crystals and count the paper cones in their little stack. The gabble is a tax that has made entire regions grind their teeth. Your teeth prefer bread, but you do your civic chewing anyway. You keep a second list, more private, of how many pinches you sold and how many you gave away to kitchens that struggle, charity measured in granules and conscience. The jar returns to its shelf with a soft thunk. The cat approves this noise and charges you 1 blink. A footstep brushes the threshold. Not a customer's glance, more a measured arrival. You know the sound because it likes to be known. 2 men step in with the air of people who carry metal in their pockets and civic duty in their posture. They are cordial, not friendly. You are cordial, not surprised. One has a little leather folder with strings. The other has a wooden case that could hold either a recorder or a trap for hubris. It holds counterweights, which is the same thing. You nod toward the scale as if introducing mutual friends. Good day, Master Baker. Good day, Jur. The ritual is the same as kneading: push, fold, let time do its work. He glances at your posted tariff-to-chalked equivalences. You trimmed a minute ago and taps the line for the froment bowl with a fingernail. You keep your face relaxed in a shape that says yes, not finally, numbers we both enjoy. His colleague opens the little case, revealing a nested family of weights like Russian dolls who believe in fines. They begin with the scale, of course. Your pan receives their test weight with a tiny metallic kiss. The needle swings, trembles, settles exactly where you taught it to settle. You watch his eyebrow for movement. It doesn't move, which is the inspector's way of saying acceptable. He asks for a loaf from the rack. You offer one of the chestnut batards that was born at dawn with a clean ear. He sets it on the pan, then adds and subtracts weights until the needle makes that same civilized stop. He writes a number in the leather book. You pretend not to see it because pretending not to see is how civilized people watch everything. Mainstream aside folded into the parchment, the posted text du pain pins price to grain and sometimes to flour quality. Bakers are expected to adjust loaf size rather than coin when markets wobble. It looks elegant on the board and feels athletic at the bench. You have learned to be nimble with dough and docile with chalk. Now their attention strays to the oven. Fire is where inspectors and bakers become unlikely cousins. Both prefer cities that keep their houses. He lays a palm near the mouth, checking for a civil draft rather than a tantrum. Peers at the flue collar where soot accumulates like gossip, and nods at the neat brush, leaning like a soldier by the ash pit. You mention, casually, that you swabbed before first loading and swept between waves. He mentions, casually, that a shop 2 streets over singed a beam last winter and now pays in reputation as much as coin. Historians still argue whether municipal fire edicts in this century were enforced with the same zeal in every quarter or bent quietly for trades that catered to bellies. Regardless, chimneys always stand for conscience. Back at the counter he asks for your guild book, the register of dues, apprentices, signatures from feast days, when bread and pride walk in procession. You turn the pages to the last quarter. Names, marks, careful script that says somebody taught me my letters and I paid attention. He follows with a finger, checking dates, pausing at the entry where you took on ETN for 6 months and then crossed him out when ETN decided that dawn was for other people. You hide a smile. He hides one too. Everyone knows an ETN. Quirky tidbit peeks from the drawer, a small broom you keep just for threshold sweeping when officials arrive. An aunt swore that 3 brisk strokes before they spoke would sweep out fines and invite fairness. You don't believe in it, except obviously you do. Because your hand has already given the door 3 polite flicks while you were thinking of other things. The jeweler steps across the newly tidied line as if pride needs a runway. He asks about marks your poncon. You show him a cooled loaf from the earlier wave where your house cross sits clean on the crown, and the batards wear their ears like a signature. He nods. He's seen worse calculus cut into dough. Have you any complaints? He asks in that tone officials use when they hope the answer is no because writing yes takes longer. You mention gently that a wood seller delivered logs that hissed more than burned. He writes the name in a corner as if to promise he will frown at that man later. Your fluaunt breathes the word liar because flues despise damp wood almost as much as cats despised mint. Now the salt. He points to the jar with the gabelle's invisible friend perched on it and asks to see your cones. You lay 3 on the counter, measured pinch, a measured pinch, a measured pinch hand. He weighs one as if it might confess to additional sodium by guilt alone. It doesn't. He nods again. That restrained little nod bureaucrats save for situations where they cannot fault you but refuse to be seen approving of joy. First joke of the noon hour. You consider asking whether the gabelle grants a discount for saints or cats. You decide your sentence should not end and immediately escorted to the door. He opens the leather book and writes in that careful clerk's hand. A stamped seal appears, small as a coin but heavier with mood, and he presses it under your latest entry, inspected, compliant. The pressure of the stamp leaves a faint echo on the page beneath. You like this whisper of approval far better than loud praise. He asks about weights again, and you because it is your small theater hand, him the very smallest in your box, the one that almost hums with exactness. He balances it on his finger like a child might balance a cherry and returns it to the box with a look that says, "You keep your toys tidy." You do. Historians still argue whether night baking bands born of fire, fear, and neighbor complaints were toothless by your century or enforced in sporadic bursts when magistrates couldn't sleep. You keep your own rule. Begin before dawn, not deep in night. Let the bell, not the stars, be your witness. The juror glances at your shutter bar and seems to read the same policy in wood. He asks about feast days, about Saint Honor, about the special breads you will parade next month with wreaths and ribbons. You tell him you have willow ready for crowns and a sack of anise waiting to perfume the festival loaves. He writes nothing. But his mouth changes at the edges in a way that belongs to someone who remembers a particular childhood bun. Second joke. You almost invite him to help braid a crown. You decide to keep your audience to the cat, who is already nodding as if promoted to master of ceremonies. He tests one more bowl, just to make the numbers feel unambiguous. Weight holds, price holds, your smile holds. He closes the leather folder with a string and gives the smallest of bows. Until next quarter. Until next quarter, you echo. The door pace reverses itself. The city breathes. Your shoulders drop the half-inch they carry for rituals. You are not surprised to find that your chalk has, in your absence, written a little flourish on the edge of the board. Perhaps the broom taught it. So you erase the curlicue and replace it with a number that means everything tallied. You sit again and add 3 lines to the ledger. Flour out, loaves sold, salt cones, blessed by bureaucracy. You draw a dot beside the convent's midge to remind yourself to wrap it with string and ribbon. Piety appreciates presentation. The cat relocates to the warmest corner of your arithmetic and drapes itself across your units like an editorial. Third joke. You tell it that auditors bill by the hour, not by the nap. It replies by billing you for 2 naps and a stretch. Saint Honor, pewter and patient, watches from his nail. You touch the little face with the back of your knuckles. Not prayer, exactly more, a handshake through time. Your hands smell of ledger, wood and flour, and a faint ghost of toast. The oven's breath eases toward pie warmth. Laws, weights, salt, stamps, these are the rails your day runs on. Crust is the scenery, crumb the passengers. You close the book with a neat clap and loop the string around it in a figure 8, not because it matters but because order, after all that heat, is its own kind of rest. The next hour will belong to feasts and fasts and the small spells bakers keep for luck. For now, the rules have found you ready. The coins approve, and the cat signs off with a yawn that sounds exactly like civic peace. With the jurors gone and the ledger tied like a tidy parcel, you turn the oven's afterglow toward celebration and restraint to tempos that share the same bricks. The vault hums in a lower key. You nudge a billet to the side just to keep the room's heartbeat even. Festival doze like warmth that behaves, not heat that brags. You set the bay sprig on the sill where it can pretend to supervise and reach for the quote ingredients that mean occasion even before anyone tastes them. A scoop of finer flour, a handful of sugar saved from a merchant who thinks sweetness is minted, a sniff of orange blossom you bought last spring from a traveler who sold vials and stories at the same price. First, feast. You wafer a crown brioche, richer than your everyday bread, eggs brightening the bowl like miniature sunrises. Butter softened near the oven until it bends without sulking. Mainstream fact, to hang on the hook by Saint Honor Catholic France in your century lives by a calendar braided with saints' days. Processions and parish rituals. Confraternities sponsor bread for feasts, and bakers march with wreaths when the bell says honor is due. For Saint Honor's own day, you'll braid a big crown and a family of small ones. Willows threaded through the center like a halo you can slice. You stir, you fold, you talk. Don't be shy, you tell the dough that dreams of silk. The cat, who has never met a festival it didn't nap through, relocates to a place of maximum supervisory value, the ribbon drawer. First joke, you inform it that ribbon is not a bed. It replies by inventing the new discipline of textile quality assurance and billing you for 2 audits and a stretch. You prep the thieves' tiny beans as old as mischief because epiphany always comes whether winter remembers manners or not. One goes into each crown brioche, tucked like a secret, where it will not offend a tooth but will crown a table monarch for the afternoon. Historians still argue whether, by the 17th century, the fave was already a universal bakery custom in towns, or remained mostly a household game that shops adopted more broadly later. You cover both bets by using beans for the modest crowns and a little trinket for the grande, if the client insists on fashion. Either way, a paper crown waits on the shelf, cut from last year's almanac, because kings are cheap and fun when made of newsprint. You bench the enriched dough, smooth as a cat's idea of itself, and braid 3 strands for the big circle over, under. Tuck until it couches like a wreath that learned geometry. A brush of egg wash makes it shine now and later. A dusting of pearl sugar pretends to be snowfall that remembered to be sweet. For the parish, you set aside a few smaller crowns with simpler braids. Piety loves plenty, but also respects budgets. Quirky tidbit you're fond of. An old neighbor swore that inscribing the word joie with the tip of a knife on the underside of the crown told the crumb to behave for guests. You don't carve letters, but you may have whispered the word anyway, which probably counts. Fasts next. The same bricks that lacquer feast bread will temper Lenten loaves into sober companions for stew. You pull forward sacks with a darker personality, more bran, more honesty and reserve, egg and butter for people who haven't noticed the calendar. Mainstream fact, as steady as the scale, in this era, abstinence from meat and on stricter days. From animal fats, shapes, kitchens, for calendars worth of Wednesdays, Fridays, and whole seasons. Lenten breads, leaner, and shopfronts shift from rich to righteous without changing address. You write carom in chalk near the sill so apprentices who exist in your imagination will not forget, and butter things that should not shine. Into one batch you fold a whisper of anise for a feast coming to streets over rogation days. When processions bless fields and plead with weather like a moody landlord, you shape those as Fauvus's flattish, leaf-scored breads that take their pretty from the blade, cousins to Faugus's farther south. Historians still argue whether the names traveled with people or plants, whether Fauves in Anjou and Faugus in Provence are the same bread with different accents or polite relatives who don't share shoes. Your knife speaks leaf either way, and the oven agrees. You mark one pan Pain Bennett, bread for blessing. The parish will bring a basket lined with linen stitched by hands that know both prayers and practicality. You'll lay the blessed loaves in it and accept, in return, a smile that counts as currency you can't spend and wouldn't trade. You score a little cross modest, no braggadocio, because marks can be both gauge and genuflection. You set them to proof on the warm bench and let their skins breathe. Blessed bread resents a hurry the way saints resent shortcuts. Between feast and fast, you tuck in the superstitions that bakeries collect, like flour in seams. You tie a thin ribbon to the ecu-villain handle for luck on days when dough is moody. You don't recall why you started, but it does no harm and may have helpfully annoyed the cat. You drop a single grain of salt into a batch for courage. Your nod to an aunt who claimed salt reminded bread of the sea and kept it from fear. You still toss a pinch over your shoulder for the devil, who by now must have a brine collection worth cataloging. Second joke, you imagine him labeling his jars: Tuesday, Master B, post-inspection, notes of bay and regret. Weather has moods and dough reads them before you do. On storm days, proofing sulks. On crisp mornings it shows off. You slide boards nearer or farther from the oven mouth with the small, no-drama authority of someone who has moved furniture in the same room for years. The fluent sniffs your adjustments and hums a note that says, "Yes, that's better," or possibly, "I was right all along." If the wind swings around and pulls at the mouth, you park a bucket as a windbreak and mutter a reminder to yourself not to whistle. The retired master's no whistling ordinance is still in force by custom, if not by law. In the corner waits a festival mold carved with a sheaf and a tiny face Saint Honor, or maybe anyone who ever carried a peel. You press dough into it for two little faces to hand to children who line the procession route with eyes that believe ovens are magic. You dust the mold with flour first so it releases cleanly. Otherwise you get saints with smudged noses and the parish's gossip column writes itself. You set two aside for Madame Ledger's grandsons, who have learned the fine art of arriving as the second tray cools and offering a performance of surprise that improves with practice. The crowns have risen into their own bravado. You brush them again, nestle thieves true, and carry them like small, edible coronations to the oven. Deck heat now is friend level, not warrior. You load with a lighter wrist, because rich does bloom with courtesy, not shock. The room smells like butter, negotiating with memory. You draw the bouchon close for a minute to help the crowns puff, then vents so glaze lacquer can set without pouting. The leaf-scored phallus go in behind steam, wakes their pattern into a pretty you can eat. While they learn color, you string willow through the big crown's center to make a handle that pretends to be a triumphal arch. Willows don't argue with heat, they like to be useful. You sort ribbons: blue for the parish, red for the guild banner, gold for the Saint's Day loaf that will sit in the window and recruit converts. The cat inspects the gold, decides it clashes with fur, and returns it to the drawer in a way that counts as assistance in exactly one language spoken by cats. A bell 2 streets away begins practice chimes. The choir is rehearsing something that will sound like bread if you listen sideways. You brush a little syrup water and sugar you warmed by the flue over the crown's shoulders so they glow more generously. You promise the fasting loaves you will not do the same. Fairness is a kind of seasoning. The crowns come out first, light golden, sugar pearls glazed like dew, braids shining as if someone whispered compliments at the right moment. You slide a tiny paper crown into the curve of the largest and catch yourself smiling at something as silly as a paper hat. The phalluses follow, leaf veins browned just enough to show up on a table like a pattern sewn by a patient ant. Payne Bennett rests on a separate board, cooling with the decorum of bread that will be held up and blessed before it is broken. Mainstream aside, placed gently, confraternities often funded the bread blessed and shared at Mass. Parish registers show names, pennies, and loaves drifting through a year as predictably as saints' days. Your name lives in those pages in compact letters. A reminder that ovens talk to churches even when nobody argues about theology in the shop. You wrap the parish basket with care, tie it with blue ribbon, and set the willow-handled crown in the window, where its shine will temper even the most Lenten mood a fraction. Third joke arrives like cinnamon on air, which you are not using today. Restraint noted. You tell the cat that if it finds the fave, it will be king for a day. It declines, explaining that it already holds absolute monarchy over naps. You concede. You stand a moment in the mild heat, and try to hear what the room says when it forgets you are listening. It says feast and fast are not enemies. They are measures in the same song. It says a paper crown can be dignified if tied with clean ribbon. It says blessed bread tastes like ordinary bread until someone shares it. And then it tastes like ceremony. It says superstition is only ridiculous until you face a sulking doe and need an ally you can name. Historians still argue whether these customs traveled more by parish law or by kitchen rumor. Your counterargument is tray-shaped and cooling. You tuck a little charm into your apron pocketa, single fave reserved for your own table tonight, because games at home make even bakers forgive butterless stews. You loop the big crown by its willow and carry it to the front where sunlight treats it like stained glass learned to be edible. You slide the fasting loaves beside it, their humbler faces no less proud. The shop now holds both calendar moods at once, and the bricks have somehow agreed to them both. You tap St. Honor's pewter cheek with your knuckle a thank you. Not a request stand, the metal warms your skin just enough to feel like an answer. Afternoon leans in on soft soles, and the oven's heat ripens from warrior to nurse no more, ear-chasing mahogany. Now the long, even kindness that turns custard, glossy and fruit-patient. You rake coals to the cheeks, mop the deck with a barely damp ecovillain, and lay out shallow tins like silver moons. Pears you poached last autumn reappear from the cool cellar. Sliced and fanned, a pan of onions turned sweet in yesterday's pan drippings waits for a Lenten greens torte with chard and a hint of anise. 2 custards flaons that remember the Middle Ages shiver in their jugs, wanting only low heat and faith. The vault hums approval, the fluante lowers her song, and St. Honor's pewter cheek throws a friendly wink in the baking shimmer. Mainstream fact, to plant beside the peel, in many French towns, households long used the baker's oven after the bread wave for du Bowlinger sending casseroles, pies, and Sunday roasts to ride the brick's afterglow, because private ovens were scarce or stingy. You keep a chalk for names and a system for not mixing Madame Leger's spinach tart with the tavern's meat pie by accident. You score initials in a corner of paper. L, a discreet X for the tavern, a tiny cross for the parishand tie, each bored with a color thread. You'll remember even after 3 deliveries and 1 chatty neighbor. Quirky tidbit you learned from a toothless genius. If you poke a pea through the lid near the rim, it turns from green to olive exactly when the filling sets. You still do it sometimes because peas are moral and rarely lie. Apprentices, at last, emerge from errands and naps, disguised as sweeping Matthew, who believes a peel is a jousting lance, shoulders in with enthusiasm and splinters. Jean, who uses quiet the way some people use knives, lays linen with a grace that makes even flour behave. You set both at the bench with the afternoon's curriculum. For him, how to carry heat without announcing it to the street. For her, how to coax a custard to the deck without teaching it to swim. First joke, you tell Matthew the peel is a violin, not a spear. He tries to look like Paganini and almost spears the cat, who files a complaint with head office the cat. You slide the onion chard torte into the volgental near the mouth, then tuck the pear tart farther back where sugar likes to catch a faint bronze. The flaons go in between, trembling a little, which is what they are supposed to do until they aren't. You never close the bouchon hard for these. A finger's gap keeps the surface from sulking. And the room fills with the kind of perfume that tells neighbors to invent errands. Historians still argue whether 17th-century guild boundaries between boulangers, patissiers, and charcutiers were rigorously policed outside the largest cities or flexed under local habit. Your quarter runs on the practical treaty that bread rules the morning. Pastry and pies rent the afternoon, and nobody tells the sausage men how to salt. Baskets next the day's small parade. You lay a thick mitch for the convent in the bottom of the big willow carrier. Nest the Payne Bennett on its own board with a blue ribbon piety, but also logistics, and add 6 chestnut-coated batards for the tavern. tied with twine because carters always stack and gravity always files lawsuits. A smaller basket gets 2 fowasses, with leaf scores for the parish clerk who paid partly in ink last month and partly in gossip worth more than coin. Coins you tuck into a leather purse that knows its way through streets better than your feet do. You hand Jean the convent basket because she carries like a saint and looks nuns in the eye, without apologizing. You give Matthew the tavern load because he needs practice with doors, elbows, and opinions. You keep the parish clerk's fowasses for yourself because he will want to talk about taxes and Latin. You can nod in both languages. The cat walks the lintel and pretends to assign neighborhoods. Second joke, you ask it for a delivery route. It points at the sunbeam and claims it is already there. Streets in the afternoon, where a different grammar, less clatter, more errands tumbling into each other. You and your companions step out. Wicker creaks, warm bread breathes through cloth, and people turn their heads the way they turn for bells. At the convent door, the turnstile hatch spins. An unseen hand receives the basket with a murmur of thanks and the clink of coin that sounds clean because it was counted by someone who believes in columns in heaven. You mention the paper crown for their feast loaves next week. A folded note returns through the hatch, 2 more crowns, 1 smaller for the infirmary. You tuck the paper into your sleeve with the pride that belongs to work that gets invited back. At the tavern, air changes from prayer to pepper. The keeper leans on the sill with the movable grin of a man who can carry 3 mugs and 4 roomers. You lay 6 petards on the counter, slice 1 heel for his stew, and he rewards you with a mug of small ale and the latest story about a woodseller who waits his cords. You confirm with a diplomatic hum. Mainstream aside, counted with the coins, bakeries often kept steady accounts with inns, barracks, and hospitals' loaves, traveling daily. Ledgers settling weekly, the city's stomach kept regular by people who remembered each other's mornings. Back in your street with lighter baskets, you trade greetings with a seamstress who begs the oven for space at dusk. Stuffed apples, only half sinful, and you pencil her name on the chalkboard under after pies. You point out to Matthew where the cobbles slope and why you never carry across that seam when frost lives in corners. To Jean you pass the ribbon drawer key and the job of choosing colors for tomorrow's school charity crown because she reads people as cleanly as you read dough. Historians still argue whether compagnage the journeyman's traveling. Brotherhoods was already formal in your century, or still a looser drift of shop-to-shop learning. Whether or not the rites are written yet, you teach as if someone will carry your habits to another town and call them theirs. The oven calls you home with the pastry smell that abolishes conversation. You draw the flaons first, their centers set to a slow wobble and their tops freckled the color of afternoon tea. The pear tart wears a gloss like varnished fruitwood and sighs when you lift the tin. The tort tapped with the back of the knife answers with the serious thok, that means the greens are bound and the bottom is honest. You set them on the rack and forbid everyone, including yourself, from cutting until steam stops arguing. Third joke, you threaten to put a fave in a flaon to punish impatience. The cat counters by nominating itself king of custard and sitting exactly where you need to set the tin. Training resumes. You line up 3 practice bowls made from trimmings and good intentions and put the lame in Jean's hand. Angle shallow, you say, let the line be a promise, not a threat. She scores. The skin opens like a small smile, and you nod because good habits should hear praise out loud. For Matthew, you stage peel drills with a board covered in barley meal. Glide, pause, jab, commit, breathe. He breathes too late, the loaf plants itself halfway to the oven. You show him the exhale on launch trick, and he grins when the next one slips like a fox into a hedge. You set them to inventory. Flour sacks rolled and tied. Salt cones counted and logged, scale weights wiped, and returned to their smug box. No whistling, you remind them, and they don't. Though Jean smiles in pure mischief and hums one note that never climbs into trouble. You teach them the paper cone fold for customers who forget cloth, 2 triangles, a twist, a tuck. You teach them your private Marksteiny score variations that mean convent. Tavern, shopfront hand, the reason you never trust memory when chalk is cheap. Wind shifts, The ant in the flue clears her throat. Clouds tug at light. You slide a billet into the ash pit to wake a little extra warmth for the seamstress's apples. Then begin the small housekeeping that keeps tomorrow's friendly. Scrape the bench. Scald the trough rim. Loosen the cords of the woodpile so the first 2 billets of dawn won't argue. Jean rubs a whisper of oil into the long peel, where a new splinter once thought about living. Matthew sweeps the threshold. 3 brisk strokes you don't believe in, except that you do. The street returns what you gave it. The convent sends a ribbon with a knot like a blessing for the Payne Bennett. The tavern keeper shouts that your batards vanished in mugs of stew and men's laughter. The parish clerk appears with a copper denier and a complaint about handwriting. Then leaves with a phallus and better penmanship. You notch the ledger with quick, square numbers while flayons cool from scandal to poetry. The big crown in the window catches a late beam and behaves like stained glass that learned restraint. Somewhere a child's voice asks if kings get extra sugar. Somewhere a nun's voice answers that kings get responsibility and sometimes a second slice. By the time shadows lengthen, your companions have become more companion than work. Jean stacks baskets by size with the left-handed neatness of someone who will leave every room better than Shifu. You tap St. Honor's pewter with your knuckle a courteous little thank you. For a day that kept its balance, sand the metal answers warm. Companions file away the last tools. The flue sings its dusk, no. Afternoon's edge slides into the quiet hour when work turns from show to housekeeping, and you steer the bakehouse toward sleep the same way you steered it toward morning. With small, exact courtesies. You lift each banneton and tap out the last whisper of flour. Brush wicker with a dry hand until it feels like clean straw, and lay the basket's mouth down along the high shelf, so tomorrow we'll find them ready to remember shapes. The linen couche gets a vigorous shake in the yard flour, drifting like polite snow. Then you peg it on the line where a late sun and a useful breeze can tell its stories. The coupote gets a scrape on. The cat patrols the bench with the long, satisfied look of a night watch captain who has already written the report. First joke, you appointed head of security, and it immediately launches a security nap. Water scalds in a copper pot by the oven mouth. You pour it into the trough, scrub the wood along the grain with a stiff brush and a pinch of salt, and watch the day come off in ribbons the color of tea. The scrape marks you've made for years, the private tide lines of batches and seasons blink through clean water, like old hieroglyphs that only your hands can read. You tip the trough, drain, and set it to dry with its mouth open, a wooden yawn aimed at tomorrow. The bench gets one last scrape, a rinse, a rub with a cloth scented faintly, and only faintly of soap. Habit is a lullaby. Tools return to places. Places return to silence. The oven gets its own bedtime. You rake the remaining embers toward the back, then feather them apart and shroud them in a soft fall of ash. Heat sinks into brick and memory, and the vault becomes a low, purring animal that agrees to wake when tapped. Mainstream fact. Folded into the ash, many French towns rang a couvre-feu cover fire. Belote night to remind households to bank their hearths for safety. The word will wander down centuries and keep its sound. Your fluent hums lower as you ease the damper nearly shut. The mouth keeps a finger's width of night to breathe by. You stroke the St. Honor medallion with the back of your knuckles, a small handshake that says, "See you before dawn." Coins wait like tidy punctuation. You sort sous and deniers into saucers, count the convent's ribboned payment, and tie the day's roll for the flour man with string that knows it's not. A little ledger neatens under your hand, loaves out, pies in salt cones reconciled with the gabelles. Invisible scowl, and you draw a final line that tells the page it can sleep. Quirky tidbit, an old master taught you to tuck a single crumb of Payne Bennett into the money drawer to remind coin of generosity. Superstition or bookkeeping with a halo, you never quite decide, but you place the crumb anyway. And the drawer seems easier in the hand when it closes. Jean and Matthew sweep the floor in long arcs that turn dust to smoothness. You hand Jean the ribbon drawer and tell her to choose tomorrow's colors for the school charity crown. She selects a blue that would have pleased any saint with eyes. You set Matthew to hang the equivalent so the mop head dries straight, and he salutes it like a banner because he is 17 and everything is nearly a parade. Second joke. You tell him if he salutes the peel, it will expect a promotion. He salutes anyway, and the cat approves the ceremony. Evening streets recompose themselves beyond the sill, vendors counting copper, a cart's last clatter, neighbors folding voices down to door-sized talk. You step outside with the delivery basket you kept back to Fowlis's for the parish clerk who traded ink for bread. One warm bowl for the widow with the boy who asks for not too dark. She takes the loaf with a nod that contains 3 kinds of gratitude and a little instruction to her son about sharing heels. You tell him that quignon is a baker's medal, and he grins as if enlisted. Home is 1 flight up or 3 doors down, depending on the year. Tonight it's close enough to carry a warm bowl without learning new cobbles. Soup wits a pot that made peace with onions. A lace of elk. Your own people, whatever the shape of that pronoun is this. You gather on benches that have learned your backs. You set the bowl and the loaf on the table with the satisfaction of a problem solved in a language everyone speaks. A slice for each, a second for some, a heel for the cook, and you allow yourself the luxury of sitting while eating rather than stork standing at a counter. Mainstream fact tucked between spoonfuls. Onion soup humble in the 17th century already marries bread and broth in a way that can persuade a weary day to forgive itself. Nobody writes law about it, everybody remembers it. Talk edits itself to the pace of chewing. The apprentices report that the tavern's carter tried to pay for a batard with a story about a broken wheel and was billed in both coin and rumor. Jean reports that the parish clerk's Latin is improved by pastry. You contribute that the inspector's eyebrow moved exactly once, and that it counted as applause. Third joke. Someone suggests promoting the flue to the guild for steady work. Someone else points out that the flue already behaves like a deacon. Night gathers its skirts. The watchman's call steps down the lane with the weight of iron and habit. Shutters clap politely. One last horse writes a sentence across the cobbles and then falls silent. You return to the bakehouse for the small ritual that always ends the day. Check the damper, a whisper open. Touch the bricks warm like an old hand. Hang the cloths, order is mercy for morning. Historians still argue whether most bakers slept above their ovens or in nearby rooms, whether ordinances against night work were mostly sermon or mostly law. You answer by rolling your shoulders and feeling the kind of fatigue that only heat and civics can produce. You have slept here, and you have slept there. Tonight you will sleep as near as needed and as far as luck allows. Before you leave, you set a shallow dish of water by the sill, for a stray that isn't your cat, and is absolutely your cat. Draw a fingertip cross in the flour dust on the bench, not pious exactly, more like a note to yourself, and sprinkle a whisper of flour across the threshold. In the morning the pattern will tell you if a mouse held a ball, or if a customer's early knock tried the latch. You douse the lantern to a polite ember, and the dark that remains is not empty. It contains a clean trough, a banked hearth, the smell of crust, and a saint on a nail who has seen worse days and better ones, and knows the difference, mostly lies in timing. The cat follows you toward home, executing one last patrol that looks suspiciously like a stretch. You carry a half loaf in your arm, the way some people carry books, and the city lowers itself into its own proof, expanding slowly under a night that knows its job. Sleep comes on quiet feet, as reliable as the bell that will roll you out before dawn. You close your door softly, as if the bricks could hear, and plan nothing at all. Now the bakehouse breathes without you for a while, and the street settles into long, even lines. You let your shoulders fall and feel the day slide away like flour from clean wood. The oven's warmth has thinned to a gentle hush, the kind of heat that smooths thought rather than sharpens it, and every tool is where it belongs, resting in its outline, waiting without hurry. You picture the baskets sleeping mouth down, the linen airing on the line, the little medallion catching a last trace of dusk, and all of it softens in your mind until edges blur and the room becomes a warm, dim shape you can fold into a pocket. Your own breath slows to match the city's. A watchman's step grows small, then smaller. A door closes, careful and kind. Somewhere a bucket settles and stops thinking about water. You lie back and let the sounds lengthen, each one farther apart than the last, until silence is not an empty space but a blanket laid end to end. If thoughts arrive, they arrive like shy birds and sit quietly on a branch, a perfect ear on a petard, a neat cross on a bowl, a ribbon that matched a child's eyes. They do not ask to be weighed. They only ask to be noticed once, gently, and then set down. The room around you dims again. Your hands, busy all day, are warm and weightless now. You imagine the banked coals under ash, their low red steady as a heartbeat you don't need to count, and you borrow that steadiness for your own. In, out, each breath a small tide that carries you a little farther from the shoreline of thought. Tomorrow will come the way dawn always comes, with keys and cat and flower and fire. For now, you let the night hold you in both arms, loose and safe, and you release the last small crease in your brow. Nothing is urgent. Everything can rise at its own sweet pace. Sleep and wake warm.